staff accessing the Jenin refugee camp or firing tear gas into hospitals, sheltering children and elderly residents. And finally, Mr Speaker, can the Foreign Secretary say what steps he will take to review whether the IDF has made any use of UK arms sold to Israel in this attack, and will he immediately suspend all arms sales, including surveillance technology, and will he ban collaboration between the UK and Israel's armed forces and military industries as a result of this horrific attack on civilians? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Lady for bringing this urgent question to the House today. It's one of deep concern to us all. Mr Speaker, we will continue to urge the Israeli Defence Forces to demonstrate restraint in this operation so that all parties can try to avoid further escalation in the West Bank and Gaza. As I say, whilst the UK will always support Israel's right to self-defence, the protection of civilians and particularly children must always be prioritised, and we expect the armed forces conduct to always be in line with international humanitarian law. So we call on Israel to adhere to those principles of necessity and proportionality while defending its legitimate security interest.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Khan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We stand on the precipice of the Gaza crisis of 2023 and the third intifada. Yesterday, an Israeli military incursion into Jenin refugee camp resulted in over 10 deaths of refugees. Hundreds were injured, and as the Honourable Lady says, the ensuing gun battle has prevented civilians from getting the military and aid and medical care that they need. Today, 5 Israeli civilians were killed in a terrorist car ramming and a stabbing, and we are in an endless cycle of violence when we need a return to the diplomatic table. Jordan and Egypt have been trying to facilitate this. They would stand ready to continue to do so, but they must see meaningful efforts to stand up to those agreements that were reached at previous meetings, such as in Aqaba. What I would call the government to try and secure today is the Israelis must stop the expansion of illegal settlements. We are seeing this continuing. It must stop. They agreed to do so at Aqaba. We must see Hamas end their terror attacks on Israel. It is wrong. It is a terror attack. And although we have no influence over them, we must use our voice to make clear that Hamas must immediately stop. And as the UK, can I ask that we please urge our Israeli friends to show restraint? Can we appoint a Middle East peace process envoy, someone who can be tasked with spending their entire time working with our allies around the region to de-escalate the situation? Our voice is unique and will be heard. We have a role to play in the peace process. And finally, will we use our UN Security Council presidency? Because with that role, we can shed a light on what is taking place.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Chair of Foreign Affairs Select Committee for her salient and indeed wise comments, as always. May I reiterate, Mr Speaker, that just on Friday, the Foreign Secretary made a joint statement with the Canadian and Australians, setting out very clearly our opposition to Israel's announcement to expand settlements across the West Bank, and we are asking Israel to halt and reverse that policy of settlement expansion with immediate effect. More widely, of course, we recognise the very real security challenges facing Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and we condemn all terrorist groups planning and carrying out attacks. But we mourn the loss of innocent lives. Indeed, the injuries to civilians and particularly children is deeply concerning. So we continue to speak, and as I say, colleagues are speaking to our Israeli teams today for that urgent need for all parties to de-escalate, preventing that further loss of civilian life.
Shadow Minister Wayne David.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. All of us must be extremely concerned about the situation in the refugee camp in the city of Jenin, as well as the ongoing deteriorating situation in this conflict as a whole. Israel has the right to defend itself against militant groups, but that right must be exercised proportionately and in line with international law. I am therefore very concerned about reports that suggest that there are significant human casualties in Jenin. I am also aware that statements from the spokesman for the United Nations Secretary-General suggest that this military operation has not been concluded within the parameters of humanitarian law. The Secretary-General is said to be, quote, deeply concerned, unquote, about the situation on the ground. Likewise, I am extremely concerned about the breaking news of a suspected car ramming in Tel Aviv, where the latest reports suggest at least 5 people are injured. Can the Minister provide an urgent update on this situation? We will always condemn acts of terrorism which only make peace harder to achieve. Regarding Jenin, I am concerned about reports that emergency health teams have been prevented from entering Jenin to treat the injured and to help people generally, and that 2 hospitals have been damaged. It has been reported by the World Health Organization that 3 children have recently been killed. I am sure that everyone in the House will agree that it is truly appalling that children, Palestinian and Israeli, continue to be the innocent victims in this conflict. Does the Minister agree with me that all civilian deaths must be thoroughly and impartially investigated, and there must be meaningful accountability? On this side of the House, let me be clear that we will continue to be strong and consistent advocates of justice, human rights and international law in this conflict. We also condemn the unacceptable use of violence against civilians in all circumstances. In our view, there will only be a lasting peace when there is a negotiated diplomatic settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The only real solution will be a settlement based on 2 states, a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and independent Palestinian state. We strongly oppose actions which are making this 2-state solution harder to achieve. So my question to the Minister, my fundamental question, is what of substance is the Minister and the Government doing to bring this immediate conflict to an end and lay the foundations for a 2-state solution?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the latest information in relation to the Tel Aviv attack, but I understand that Hamas are claiming it is as one of theirs, and we absolutely condemn Hamas's use of indiscriminate violence and attacks of this nature. There can never be any justification for such acts of violence, and we will be continuing to call upon Hamas and other terrorist groups, obviously, to permanently end their incitements against Israel. But importantly, as I say, ministers and our ambassadors will be continuing to work very closely today and the days ahead to continue to urge the de-escalation of the present situation in Jenin.
Thank you. Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Understanding that this comes in the context of 20 years of Israel building settlements that block the route to a settlement of this dispute, and understanding that Israel is failing to show restraint, failing to follow international humanitarian law, failing to protect civilians, what is the government actually going to do?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I say, and the statement put out by the Foreign Secretary with his Canadian and Australian counterparts last week set out very clearly an absolute disagreement and a clear message to the Israelis about stopping those settlement expansions, and we will continue to work with our friends and allies to make that message clearly heard.
SNP spokesperson Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Violence on all sides, of course, must be condemned. But contrary to what the Minister has said, illegal settlements are a barrier to peace. Yet the UK Government continues to fail to take any meaningful actions towards preventing this. This violence represents a serious escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Palestinians and Israelis, have, as we've heard, have lost their lives. So what assessment has been made of the potential chain reaction of violence that this could unleash? It's been confirmed that thousands of people have been displaced from the camp. What discussions has the Minister had with international colleagues on how to minimise the suffering for those refugees, civilians, now displaced twice? UN aid agencies have this morning voiced alarm at the scale of Israel's military operation in Jenin, reporting water and energy supplies have been damaged. So will the UK government commit to working with partners to provide additional humanitarian funding to restore these vital supplies for people there?
Here, here.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the UK's position on those settlements is clear. Settlements are illegal under international law, and indeed they call into question Israel's commitment to the two-state solution. So we've urged Israel to halt that settlement expansion, threatening the physical viability of a Palestinian state. And to the honourable gentleman's point, we are working with our partners, the United States, France, Germany and Italy, strongly opposing these unilateral steps. In relation to humanitarians, I'm afraid I don't have the latest information, but our teams work very closely through UNRWA and other humanitarian organisations to ensure, and I have no doubt, and I will be happy to ask the Minister to update the House later on what latest commitments are being made accordingly.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Speaker. Clearly the car ramming this morning is only the most recent of the terrorist attacks that have emanated from the city of Jenin. And so far the Operation House and Garden has resulted in the destruction of 3 labs, hundreds of IEDs, thousands of grenades. Underneath the mosque, there were 2 tunnels with hundreds of weapons. 120 people have been arrested, and clearly the terrorist activity is going to be severely limited. Behind all this is the IRGC and Hamas and the Jenin battalions. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a proportionate attempt to reduce terrorism against the State of Israel?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I say, whilst the UK remains absolutely resolute in its commitment to Israel's security, and we condemn absolutely Hamas and other terrorist groups' use of indiscriminate force, we call on all parties to maintain a proportionate balance so that we can de-escalate the existing situation, ensure that civilians are not caught up in this anymore.
Mr Speaker, with the water and electricity services in Jenin refugee camp damaged as a result of the violence, camp residents are unable to move from their homes. Many are in urgent need of food, drinking water and medical support, but the ambulances have been prevented from reaching the wounded. Will the Secretary of State raise with the Israeli authorities the issue of access for ambulances and medical teams into the Jenin refugee camp?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know that the FCGO Minister for the Middle East, Lord Ahmed, will be listening to this debate and will be able to update in the other place later on today with the ongoing discussions that he is having with Israeli counterparts.
Little Rich.
Mr Speaker, let's be clear, any loss of innocent civilian life is one too many, but let's also be clear that the Palestinian Authority have lost control over Jenin. It's become a safe haven for terrorists. Terror groups have fortified the area with IEDs, and last week they fired rockets towards Israel from inside the camp. Iran has also boasted about arming, training and funding these Palestinian terror groups that operate here. So does she agree with me that it's in the interest of both the Palestinians and the Israelis that terror groups cease these operations, which only further destabilise the Palestinian Authority as well as the region, and innocent people die as a consequence?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we recognise the very real security concerns facing Israel and the Palestinian Authority whilst they try to deal with those terrorist groups, and we condemn absolutely terrorist groups planning and indeed carrying out attacks. But to my right honourable friend's point, the loss of innocent lives, everyone is one too many, as well as what I think will be a serious number of injuries to civilians, and we are continuing to be deeply concerned by that cycle of violence in the West Bank. The urgent need for all parties to de-escalate to prevent that first loss of life remains absolutely critical.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Unless and until we acknowledge our own role in this developing tragedy, anything the Minister says at the dispatch box is essentially going to be meaningless. The increase in violence by the IDF, the expansion of settlement in the West Bank, that happens because we and other countries in the West do nothing to hold Israel to account. So can the Minister tell us now Will she commit to supporting an ICC investigation into what is happening there? And will the government here now set a timetable for the recognition of the Palestinian state?
Hear, hear. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government and across the House, on both sides of the House, do not waver from the two-state solution that we all wish to see. The question on, as I've said already, Mr. Speaker, on settlements is clear. Settlements are illegal under international law, and we will continue alongside allies and partners to make that point clear. I'm afraid in terms of the ongoing activity today, I hope that Lord Ahmed will be able to pick up later in the day as progress is made with our counterparts in Israel.
Desmond Sway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But hasn't our strategic partnership with Israel, announced in this House, afforded us any leverage over Israeli policy in the West Bank?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our strategic relationship with Israel is a strong and long-standing one, and we work with them in many areas, from security to trade. They are an important partner. This does not negate from the fact that in the situation where we are seeing today, we want to see de-escalation and to ensure that the loss of civilian lives is minimised.
I share the distress of others at the loss of civilian life. Islamic Jihad have already claimed several of the dead as Islamic Jihad fighters, and as we've heard, the Israelis say the camp was used as a hub for terrorist operations. Does the Minister think any more can be done to prevent terrorists from embedding themselves among civilians, particularly in places like refugee camps?
Mr. Speaker, we recognise, and it will be an ongoing challenge, that the security challenges faced by, in this case, both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but elsewhere in the world, where innocents living in refugee camps are used as a cover for those terrorists wishing to cause harm, is one that we all have to continue to tackle, not only in the West Bank but around the world. I think importantly in this situation we all will continue to urge de-escalation to reduce the risk of any further civilian casualties or loss of life.
Julie Elliott.
Mr. Speaker, this year has seen more Palestinians killed than any other year, more settlement starts announced than any other year, and more demolitions in East Jerusalem than any other year, more violence in general. We're on the precipice of another intifada. What action will the government be taking, not just conversations, because at the minute it looks to me as if Israel are acting with impunity and it is an all-out assault on Palestinian life. What actions will the government take, not just conversations, to bring this dreadful escalation in violence to an end?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely committed to working with all parties in the challenges around demolitions to remain calm and to avoid provocation. But we're very clear that in all but the most exceptional of circumstances, demolitions and forced evictions are contrary to international humanitarian law. The practice causes unnecessary suffering to Palestinians and indeed is harmful to efforts to promote peace. In particular, we are monitoring developments at Masafa Yatta closely and we've made our views clear to the Israeli government on this matter.
Joanna Chorley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents in Edinburgh South West have written to me with their grave concerns for the welfare of civilians and health workers in the Jenin camp. And they, like me, know that the Israeli army enjoys a climate of impunity because the international community never holds Israel to account for its actions. Israel continues to breach international law, including the 4th Geneva Convention, and as we've heard already today, settlements are war crimes under the Rome Statute. So my question for the Minister is this: what specific actions will the government take in future to ensure that Israel adheres to international law and that its leaders are held accountable for its war crimes?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I say, we have been clear, and my colleague will continue to speak with the Israeli ambassador later today to ensure that it's the UK view that de-escalation is urgently required in this difficult situation today, and also that we continue to tackle those questions around legal settlements which are contrary to humanitarian law.
John MacDonald.
When the Russians have bombed predominantly civilian areas and resulting in the death of civilians, we've rightly condemned that as a war crime. Why hasn't the government condemned these actions, which are resulting in the loss of civilian life, condemned them as a war crime? And has the government called in the Israeli ambassador to remind him in the strongest terms possible the legal responsibility that Israel has to protect civilians?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst the UK supports Israel's right to defend itself and indeed its citizens against terrorist activity, we are urging very clearly the Israeli Defence Forces to demonstrate restraint in order to prioritise the protection of civilians. And as I have already said, my right honourable friend, Lord Ahmed from the other place, will be speaking with the Israeli ambassador later today.
Philippa Whitford. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all condemn attacks on civilians, regardless of which community. But the actions of the Israeli Defence Force in Jenin are indefensible and have resulted in 2023 being one of the most lethal years for Palestinians. The UK has long claimed to support a two-state solution, endorsed UN Security Resolution 2334 and recognised that settlements are illegal under international law. So, after yesterday's appalling move to block action by citizens and public bodies to stop illegal occupation and settlements, has UK government policy changed?
Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I say, this government will continue to stress the importance of the adherence to the principles of necessity and proportionality when defending their legitimate security interests, but importantly also to continue to provide that appropriate protection to the Palestinian civilian population, and in particular, as we're seeing, to protect those children.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At around 11:30 yesterday, 17-year-old Maji Yunus Sawad Arawawi sustained a gunshot wound to the chest, and Nuruddin Hussam Youssef Mashoud, who was just 15, was shot in the head by Israeli occupation forces. Their names join a list of more than 30 Palestinian children killed by the Israeli regime since the beginning of 2023. The ultimate cause of these senseless killings is Israel's brutal and illegal occupation of Palestine that has gone on for over half a century. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, given that the government last night voted for legislation banning peaceful means of protesting against this abomination, and given Britain's humanitarian and historic responsibilities to the Palestinian people, the Minister's ducked this. I'll give it another chance. What actions have the government taken, and what will they take to ensure that Israel adheres to international law and its leaders are held to account?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I've said, we are engaging both with the Israelis and the Palestinians to urge them to de-escalate those tensions. My right friend Lord Ahmed will be speaking to the Israeli ambassador later, and indeed under international law highlighting and demanding that access for medical care and staff is allowed, so that those who are injured in the Jenin refugee camp are able to receive the medical care that they require.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The use of aerial bombardment and armoured assault by thousands of troops in a refugee camp, familiar to the people of Gaza, is now extended to the West Bank, and alongside settlement expansion is part of the annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories by Israel's far-right government. Occupation is the cause and context of these latest war crimes. Will the government acknowledge this and respond by recognising the state of Palestine?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, and across this House, we continue our long-standing position of a two-state solution. We'll continue to work with partners across the world to find a solution that allows that to happen. In the meantime, we are deeply troubled by the level of violence, and we continue to call on Israel, whilst defending itself and its citizens, to demonstrate restraint required to ease the situation in Jenin today.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
My thoughts go out to the people affected by the horrific attacks on the Jenin refugee camp. We must be clear that this is a violation of international law and that the occupying forces in particular have a responsibility to end the violence. Now, will the UK Government, and I'm giving a clear suggestion of a possible action, will they send a clear message of condemnation by bringing to an end to the importation of goods into the UK which are produced in those Israeli settlements which are deemed illegal under international law?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, we will continue to call on the Israel demonstrated goods which are made in the settlements are not allowed to be imported, and that continues to be the case. The work that we do on trade with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority is one, and the OPTs is one that we continue to grow on, and the Department for Business and Trade, I know, is very focused on that development work.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't think the Minister understands the power of office. We've heard today comments and we've heard some warm words said, but we've seen no action. As the President and holding that power with the UN Security Council, will she call the Security Council together to act now on the atrocities we've seen in Jenin? And what other measures will she actually take to stop further atrocities occurring?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. As I say, we continue to work on the peaceful two-state solution, and I know that my friend, FCD Minister for the Middle East, Lord Ahmed, who was speaking today, will be updating in the other place later on today on activity continuing.
Ruth Cadbury.
Oh, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This year's already been the deadliest for violence in the West Bank since 2005. So what assessment has the Minister made of the impact of rising Israeli violence against Palestinian civilians? And I'm going to give her another chance. Doesn't she agree that civilian deaths should lead to investigations and accountability?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, we continue to be deeply troubled by the high number of Palestinian civilians, both killed and injured, as the Honourable Lady highlights. And whilst Israel has a legitimate right to defend itself, it is important that Israeli forces exercise maximum restraint, especially in the use of live fire, when protecting that legitimate security interest.
Madam Kaiser.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I refer to my entry in the Register of Interests. Peace. It's a word we often hear in relation to Israel and Palestine, but how can peace be achieved when Palestinians are subjected to systematic and deliberate oppression and discrimination by Israeli authorities? The people in the Jenin refugee camp have already fled their homes and they've been displaced yet again. Can the Minister set out what's being done by the international community to help those who have now been displaced twice? Will she condemn the denial of access to medical care for Palestinians in Jenin? And will she join me in calling out Israel's behaviour for what it is, stated in a report from Amnesty International, that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against Palestinians?
Hear, hear. Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, our friend Lord Ahmed will be speaking to the Israeli ambassador later, and we will be making clear that we want to ensure that medical supplies are able to get into the refugee camp to provide the care that's needed for those who are injured as a result of the violence in the last 2 days.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The reports from Jenin are shocking, and particularly reports that medical teams are unable to access civilians in need. I want to support what the Chair of the Foreign Select Committee said as well, in having steps towards a solution and an ending of Israeli settlements. The UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reports that there has been at least 570 attacks by settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank this year, an average of 3 attacks a day. So what is she doing, is the Minister doing, in discussions with her counterparts on tackling the Israeli settler violence, as well as the issues faced with the new Palestinian militant groups, and action that is needed now to de-escalate the situation, as well as, again, look at the international funding for UNRWA, which is vital to support Palestinian refugees?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I say, we condemn settler violence in the strongest possible terms, and we urge the Israeli authorities to do what they can. The Foreign Secretary's statement published with Australia and Canada at the end of last week highlighted that very clear demand that the Government of Israel reverse its decision to approve over 5,700 new settlement units in the West Bank, and it needs to change to the settlement approval process, and we will continue to work with allies to achieve that.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The escalation of violence in West Bank over the last year and the killing of innocent civilians, including children, in recent days is devastating. The two-state solution that many of us hope would bring peace and stability to the region seems further away than ever. So what is the government actively doing to stop the killings of innocent people and to ensure the two-state settlement is still a diplomatic reality?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have said, we continue to work with partners and allies on the two-state solution, and indeed we call on all those caught up in the violence today to show restraint and de-escalate so that the violence can come to a halt and we can ensure that those casualties are able to receive treatment.
Graham Morris.
Madam Deputy Speaker. My good and honourable friend, the member for Cynon Valley, was absolutely correct in her remarks, and I thank her for securing this urgent question. I visited the refugee camp at Jenin in 2012, and I've visited some of the clinics and schools, and to say the conditions were grim is an understatement. But what we've seen over the last day or two is an attack by Israeli security forces on a refugee camp using missiles against children, parents, the elderly and vulnerable. This isn't about Israel defending itself, and even the White House have stated this is tyranny. When will the UK government intervene, not just with words to condemn these actions, but to do something in practical terms to support the Palestinian people undergoing such appalling oppression?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK's position on the Middle East peace process is clear, and we will continue to support the negotiated settlement which leads to a safe and secure Israel side by side with a viable and sovereign Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders. In the short term, we are calling very firmly, as are all partners around the world, on the level of restraint required by Israel Defence Forces to ensure that the violence ceases in the Jenin refugee camp as soon as possible.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member from Cynon Valley for securing this urgent question. It has been reported that medical teams have been prevented from entering Jenin. Will the Minister condemn this now from the dispatch box, and will she express to her counterpart that Palestinians must have medical aid, and can she return to the House to update MPs on the medical situation?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, international humanitarian law requires access to be made available for medical teams to treat those in need of care. So we are urging Israel to allow that as soon as possible. And I know that my colleague, the FCG Minister for the Middle East, will be raising that particularly urgently with the Israeli ambassador when he speaks to her this afternoon. And I will ensure that an update is made from the department in due course.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The last time we saw tensions rise like this, we experienced the month of hate, with instances of anti-Semitism hitting an all-time high, with abhorrent tropes seen on the streets of London. Does the Minister agree with me that whilst discussions are taking place to de-escalate the situation, that we all have a duty to temper our language to make sure that Jewish residents like my constituents don't live in fear of abuse, graffiti, racist convoys and ultimately violence, and that we all have a duty to try and tackle this on the streets where we see it?
Minister. You all have a duty to ensure that anti-Semitic voices are not allowed to cause distress or indeed violence, and we will be continuing to ensure that those who feel anxious get the support they need. We provide a great deal of support, and I know very proud of the work that the Home Office does in support of many of our Jewish communities.
Alan Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this year has already seen a record number of settlement units approved on record. The Israeli Finance Minister has instructed ministries to prepare for an additional 500,000 settlers into the West Bank. We've seen 33 Palestinian children killed. So while the government urges restraint and we get the same weak answers time and again to the dispatch box, as Israel is acting with impunity. Now I think the Minister said it slightly wrong earlier on, but it seemed that she's saying that trade with illegal settlements is now deemed illegal by the UK Government. Is that the case?
Here, here.
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, just to reiterate again in relation to settlements, our UK position is absolutely clear. Those settlements are illegal under international law, and indeed they call into question that commitment to this two-state solution which we, the UK, are committed to. So we will continue to urge Israel to halt that and ensure that the trade relationships which we have with Israel and with the OPTs can progress as it needs to.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Many of my Luton South constituents have been in touch to say how distressed they are and angry they are about the increasing violence in the West Bank. Many have set out that the access to supplies, clean water, powdered milk for children is at risk. So, beyond conversations, can the Minister confirm that there will be additional support for healthcare and medical organisations on the ground so that they can support civilians?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will ensure that once my good friend from the other place has had discussions with the Israeli ambassador, that further information on how we will continue to support UNRWA and other humanitarian groups will be focused in particular on this instance, but I'm afraid I don't have more information to hand at the moment.
Jonathan Edwards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one eyewitness in an interview with CNN has compared the impact of the incursion to a natural disaster in terms of the destruction to infrastructure such as roads, water systems and electricity. What role can the British government play in helping reconstruction to reduce further humanitarian suffering? And is it the policy of the British government that the State of Israel should pay reparations for damage to civilian infrastructure in the occupied territories as a result of military activity?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, we have seen on our TVs the very violent activities today, and we call on the Israeli Defence Forces and the Israeli government to demonstrate the restraint that is required to both prioritise the protection of civilians, ensure that we can see medical support get into the Jenin camp, and indeed a de-escalation of the violence as soon as possible.
Ian Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to pass on my thanks to the Honourable Member for Cullen Valley for actually raising this issue today. I'm going to give the Minister one more chance before we finish. Can't she set out with far, far greater clarity than done so far what actual actions the government are going to take as President of the United Nations Security Council to ensure Israel adheres to international law and its leaders are held accountable?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, the Foreign Secretary, as I set out excuse me, earlier this week, the Foreign Secretary spoke to Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen on the 26th of June, and indeed Palestinian Prime Minister today on the 16th of June. Those conversations with those leading is going on day by day, and I know that Lord Ahmed will also be able to update his conversations later on in the day in the other place.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel is clearly a breach of international humanitarian law, as well as multiple Security Council resolutions. The Minister has ducked the question, the very specific question on the Security Council on multiple occasions. As the President of the Security Council, the UK has a particular power to convene the Security Council and indeed a responsibility to do so. So can the Minister give a very clear-cut answer? Yes or no, will the UK Government convene the Security Council on this issue?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, the Government continues to have close discussions, not only obviously with the Israelis to try and ensure a de-escalation of the violence that we're seeing today, but also working closely with allies and partners to ensure that we continue to support and give the clear direction of international partners on the question of the two-state solution.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her measured and careful answers to the UQ, and I think it's important that her interest in this matter is put on record. Will the Secretary of State outline what discussions have taken place with our Israeli allies to renew peace talks, to allow both states to coexist beside each other without the tit-for-tat that has become normalised and yet is truly horrific and heartbreaking for all of those who are losing loved ones in this conflict?
Thank the right honourable gentleman for his question, and he's right. When this violence occurs, the great tragedy is that civilians are caught up in the violence where the Israeli Defence Forces are legitimately trying to defend themselves and indeed Palestinians from the terrorist threat. The Foreign Secretary continues to have a strong focus on this, and we're working both with leaders and indeed allies around the world to continue to try and find a solution.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has mentioned how this government has urged the Israeli Defence Forces to demonstrate restraint and urging de-escalation to protect civilians. But more words, because actions speak louder than words. And can the Minister say what it will take for this government to suspend arms sales to Israel until we can be sure they are not being used to violate international law and perpetuate war crimes and human rights abuses? And I'd really appreciate if the Minister could give a really well-thought-out answer to this question instead of referring to pre-scripted notes in a folder.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will continue in the fact that these violent activities are ongoing at the moment and that colleagues are in discussions right now with Israeli counterparts. I don't wish to in any way disturb those. What I am here to do is to update the House as much as we know it, but it is an ongoing situation. But I know that when my colleague Lord Ahmed makes a UQ response later in the day, he will have more information to be able to share in the other place.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I've listened carefully to the Minister, but since 2015, the Government has sold £500 million worth of arms to Israel, and UK arms have been implicated in previous atrocities against Palestine. So can the Minister categorically say if any of that military equipment has been used in Israel's assault on the Jenin refugee camp? And doesn't this attack again show why the government should suspend all arms sales to Israel until it abides by international law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Government takes its defence export responsibilities very seriously, and indeed we operate some of the most robust export controls in the world. And I can reiterate, as colleagues have heard me do before in previous roles, that all applications for export licence are assessed on a case-by-case basis against very strict criteria, and we will not issue a licence if there's a clear risk that the equipment might be used for internal repression. So the Government will continue to monitor closely the situation in Israel, Gaza and the West Bank. And if extant licences are found to be no longer consistent with the criteria, those licences would be revoked.
Thank you. That concludes proceedings on the statement. Point of order, Don Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, my dad, God rest his soul, said to me that there are not many levers to tackle injustices, but boycotting is one of them. And that's why I couldn't vote for yesterday's anti-boycotting bill by the government, which ministers and lawyers have said would likely place the United Kingdom in breach of international law obligations. The member for Rutland and Melton, who I have informed that I will be mentioning today, in response to the minister said, the Foreign Office's own legal advice states that the bill could breach UNSC 2334. How am I being told repeatedly from the dispatch box that this is not the case, when that is what the government lawyers are saying themselves? Please do not repeat that this does not change anything when the government lawyers themselves say it does. That's what the member said. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, Conservative members seem to have been informed that the bill could breach international law, while the government ministers state the opposite. I'm minded to believe the member for Rutland and Melton, but can, Madam Deputy Speaker, you advise me on what I can do to ensure that the government places all of their legal advice in the library so that we can all have a read and discover who's telling the truth?
Order. No, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and for having given me notice of it. And no, the Chair does not have the power, nor ever has had in our whole constitutional development, to require the government to place any document in the library, but certainly not legal advice. And the Honourable Lady, who is well versed in these matters, has rightly used the opportunity of a point of order to put her opinion on the record, and I'm sure that that will have been heard by the Treasury bench. But she is well versed in these matters, and she will know that it has been the long-standing practice of governments of every political persuasion not to publish their legal advice. It is the normal course. It is the normal course. And I certainly have no power from the Chair to compel the government to do otherwise. Point of order.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week in Justice Questions, the Secretary of State for Justice conflated the conviction and the charging rate for sex offenders and rapists, alleged rapists in the UK. Every day, 300 women will be raped, and only 3 of those end up having a charge. What can the House do in relation to this matter in order to emphasise to ministers that conflating the conviction and the charging rate in courts is a basic error, and that the Secretary of State should know better and not repeat this sloppy practice of mixing up the charging and the conviction rate in what is a very sensitive matter around rape convictions?
Absolutely right.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order, and as Mr. Speaker and Deputy Speakers have said many times from this chair, the matter of interpretation of statistics is not a matter for the Chair. One person looks at statistics and comes to one conclusion. Someone else looks at statistics and comes to a different conclusion. The Honourable Lady has made her point well, and I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have heard it. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. I call Sir Gavin Williamson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg that leave be given to bring in a bill to require His Majesty's Government to recognise formally the Republic of Somaliland, to make provision in connection with the establishing of diplomatic relations with the Republic of Somaliland and for connected purposes. If I can also draw the House's attention to the register of my interest. Madam Deputy Speaker, the 4th of July is often known as an Independence Day for another country, but I'm not here to talk about the United States, but actually the Republic of Somaliland. On the 26th of June in 1960, Britain granted independence to the British Protectorate of Somaliland. And it was in that euphoria, in that moment, that Somaliland a few days later entered into a union with the old Italian trust territories of Somaliland. But this proved to be a deeply unhappy union. Madam Deputy Speaker, that union, while it started off in hope, while it started off in optimism, ended up in tragedy. You saw the rise of a brutal military dictatorship based in Mogadishu, whose next steps were the persecution and the genocide of so many Somalilanders. Over the preceding years, you saw a genocide that unfolded that saw the loss of so many lives. You're not just talking about tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of lives. In the capital city of Somaliland, you saw Somali Air Force jets rising to the skies to drop bombs on the people of Hargeisa. 90% of the city was completely destroyed, but also not just in Hargeisa, but so many cities right across Somaliland. You saw so many of the nomadic tribes of Somaliland persecuted, with their only source of life, the wells that provided them vital water, being poisoned. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that genocide, and sadly, so much of the world did not notice or paid no attention. And it wasn't just the people that were killed. Every single family in Somaliland was affected by this, that was touched by this violence. But so many families were displaced, even within the own borders of Somaliland, or they had to flee to neighbouring countries, such as Ethiopia and Djibouti. Now, we should take a great sense of pride in this country because, of course, we welcomed so many of those Somalilanders to our shores, and they made us their home like so many Somalilanders have done in the past. And it's that connection that goes long before the independence, that actually ties our two nations together. Out of that genocide, out of that civil war, you saw the emergence once again of an independent country. In 1991, Somaliland was able to declare itself free of Somalia. It was able to stand proud and independent away from the persecution and the genocide that they had suffered for so long. But they have asked the world for over 30 years now for recognition. They have asked the world to recognise what is there on the Horn of Africa. And they've listened to countries such as Britain and the United States, France and Germany, that has turned to them and said, well, we expect certain things. We expect a democratic process, parliamentary elections, presidential elections. We expect a judicial process. We expect you to educate your boys and girls. We expect you to be welcoming and a safe place for people to visit. And Somaliland has delivered that. Yet they still wait. They still wait for recognition from countries such as Britain, the United States, France, Germany, and so many others. And that wait is too long. Madam Deputy Speaker, in Somaliland, you have a country that is doing everything that it believes that people expect a democratic, free country to be doing. But it does ask for something in return. The people of Somaliland over so many decades have been willing to look to Britain as a friend. In fact, when we were at our greatest need during the Second World War, the Somaliland people joined with us against our battle against fascism. They fought side by side with British soldiers. When I was in Hargeisa and visited the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, you saw British names in that cemetery, and you saw Somalilanders' names in that cemetery. Blood was spilt by both our nations for those common values and common interests. But we now need to step up as a nation. We now need to do something more than actually just being there. It is time to recognise. For too long we have resisted that. We always find excuses for inertia and inaction. Now is the time for us to start to be brave and actually reward the people that are doing the things that we as a nation ask them to do. Somaliland does not live in the easiest of neighbourhoods. It has difficult neighbours. But being a democratic country, being a country that wants to educate its boys and its girls by having a judicial system that is fair and robust, these are things that we need to be rewarding. This is what we need to be putting on a pedestal to say, this is an example that we want others to follow. Madam Deputy Speaker, I say that if a government is not going to take the action that is required, let it be the British House of Commons that takes the lead. Let it be the House of Commons that leads the way. If the FCDO is deaf, let us show what the will is for us to recognise what is a nation. A country which has its own processes of judiciary, it has its elections, it has every function of a democratic nation that we want to see. So if the government is reluctant to do it, let this House do it. Let us make sure that we reward those who are doing what is needed and is required. As we look at Somaliland, you see a country that is developing. You see a country that has got investment coming into it. And I'd like to thank the British government for the investment in Berbera Port, the investment on the highway north to Hargeisa. But by the simple act of recognition, you can transform the lives of 5.7 million people, making every single one of them more prosperous, enabling Somaliland, a good ally of this country, to play a bigger role on the world stage and play a vital role in supporting the values that we in this House hold dear. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that it may seem a very far-off place. I recognise that maybe a nation of 5.7 million people does not seem significant to Britain, but it is significant. It plays a pivotal role in terms of Africa, and I urge this House to take the action that is required to support the Republic of Somaliland and make sure that we deliver for the people of Somaliland as they have defended what we value so dearly, which is democracy and freedom.
The question is that the Right Honourable Member have leave to bring in the bill. As mayors of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Mr Clive Betts, Sir Robert Buckland, Dr Lisa Cameron, Alan Cairns, John Speller, Ian Paisley, Alex Shelbrook, Paul Blomfield, Alexander Stafford, Kim Johnson and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Republic of Somaliland Recognition Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of November, Madam Speaker.
Friday the 24th of November. Thank you. And now we proceed to the motion on the estimate for the Department for Work and Pensions. I call the Minister to move the motion formally.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, and the debate will be opened by the Chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to have been granted today's debate about DWP spending. I want to focus in my remarks in particular on universal credit, whose rollout started 10 years ago this year in 2013. But DWP is forecast to have, by some considerable margin, the highest expenditure of any government department, £279.3 billion this financial year, followed by the Department of Health and Social Care at 201 billion. So it's by a considerable distance the largest. Of course, the DWP forecast is uncertain. Almost all its funding counts as annually managed expenditure. Hard to forecast demand-led spending. DWP's admin spending, the resource DEL, is 27% lower in real terms this year than it was in 2010-11. The universal credit spending is forecast to be £50.8 billion this financial year, which is 8.8 billion higher than forecast in these estimates last year, reflecting both the recent much needed uprating and also a higher caseload. In February, 4.5 million households were receiving universal credit payments. One of the key arguments in the business case for universal credit was the prospect of reducing fraud and error. Nearly a quarter of the £34 billion net present value gain expected over 10 years from introducing universal credit was due to come from lower fraud and error. In fact, fraud and error have been much worse than they were with the legacy benefits. The Department's May statistics this year show that the universal credit overpayment rate did decrease, but it decreased from an astronomical 14.7% last year to the year before last to 12.8% last year. Now, I know that the Department is setting out to address this problem and has obtained some resources from the Treasury to do so. Underpayments were actually the highest ever recorded last year at 1.6%. But I do hope the Minister will be able to tell us about plans for tackling those problems. An additional reason it's so important to get the decisions right at the moment is that universal credit is a passport to cost of living support payments. There was, Madam Deputy Speaker, a strong case for merging the various benefits into universal credit, and the success of the system in getting urgently needed support out effectively in the pandemic was very important and also very impressive. But there are some big problems. Above all, the problem of the 5-week wait between applying for benefit and receiving the first payment. With legacy benefits, the first payment would arrive usually a week and a half or so after applying. With universal credit, having spent hundreds of millions of pounds on what we were always assured was agile technology, the same thing now takes 5 weeks. That is a very fundamental and unnecessary flaw. The security is absent from social security. The government rejected in January 2021 the Select Committee's recommendations to eliminate the wait and instead to pay all first-time claimants of universal credit a starter payment equivalent to 3 weeks of the standard allowance of universal credit, just to tide people over. The government response pointed out, of course, that claimants can access advances, but those are loans. Repayments reduce the already low monthly awards. Repaying advances is a very major driver of the explosive growth that we've seen in food bank demand. Our colleagues in the other place on the Lord's Economic Affairs Committee, with their Conservative chair, they succinctly highlighted the consequences of the 5-week wait in July last year. And I quote, "The 5-week wait for the first payment drives many people into rent arrears, reliance on food banks and debt." So I do want to ask the Minister once again if the government will reconsider our recommendations or whether we have to wait for a different government for that fundamental flaw to be addressed. One area where the government has listened to the committee, I'm very pleased to say, is on reimbursement of childcare costs for people claiming universal credit. I warmly welcome lifting the cap and the upfront payments for childcare announced in the budget, and I hope our future reports will have comparable levels of success. And those changes will support people to be in work in future. The Child Poverty Action Group published a fascinating report last week called "You Reap What You Code," highlighting areas where the Universal Credit computer system does not deliver what it should. They gave the example that legislation and guidance allow some groups to submit a universal credit claim up to a month in advance, but the system doesn't allow that. And there isn't an adequate workaround either outside the digital system. So some care leavers and prisoners expecting release can miss out on entitlement which they are due. For all its success in the pandemic, and I am kind of unstinted in my recognition of that, for all that success, the rigidity of the digital system is a problem. And I wonder if the Minister is able to tell us whether a fix is planned for that problem of early claims highlighted by Child Poverty Action Group last week. Do the level of benefits meet need in the way they are supposed to? Are they representing value for the taxpayer? The committee is conducting an important inquiry at the moment into benefit levels in the UK. That'll report in the first half of next year. Benefit levels are very low. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Trussell Trust, told the committee, and I quote, the basic rate of universal credit, its standard allowance, or equivalents in previous systems, is now at its lowest level in real terms in almost 40 years. That's CPI adjusted, and its lowest ever level as a proportion of average earnings. They estimate from pretty careful research that a single adult needs £120 a week to cover essentials: food, utilities, vital household items, travel. That's excluding rent and council tax. Universal Credit's standard allowance is £85 per week for a single adult over 25. That's a shortfall of at least £35 per week. And deductions, for example, for advance payments often pull actual support well below the headline rate. So they call for an essentials guarantee. And they make the point, and indeed it's been suggested this week, that in the press, that we might get a below inflation uprating of benefits next year, making these problems even worse. And I would be grateful if the Minister can give us any reassurance on that front, because that would be very bad news indeed. Yes, I will give way.
Very grateful to the Chairman and Select Committee for giving way. Does you agree with me that the government needs to resist this temptation to try and plug the gaps with these one-off payments, but actually look at the wider, more structural problems that we have with the social security system, rather than just trying to plug gaps when the thing's falling apart, it seems?
Yeah, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point, and I very much value his contribution to the work of the Select Committee, and I hope we will be able to look at some of those structural issues in the course of our inquiry. I think he's quite right. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, if universal credit did meet basic needs, other demands, including on food banks, would decrease. When the £20 a week uplift was introduced to universal credit, there was a significant drop in food bank usage. When the uplift was removed, food bank use went straight back up again. Universal credit was intended to make work pay, but how can it achieve that if people don't have, for example, the means to pay a bus fare? Trussell Trust, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Public Law Project, all highlighted in evidence to the committee not being able to buy public transport tickets as a significant barrier to work. As far as we can tell, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has made no assessment at all of whether benefit levels are adequate. If I'm wrong about that, I'd very much welcome the Minister telling us, but there's certainly no evidence of such an assessment ever having been made, and I hope that the Department will look very carefully at the findings of our report when they are in due course published. One other point highlighted in a briefing for this debate prepared by the charity Barnardo's. They described the two-child limit as the single biggest policy driver of child poverty in the UK. Ending it, they say, would be the most cost-effective way of reducing child poverty, lifting 250,000 children out of poverty and easing the poverty of a further 850,000 children. The cost of doing so would be £1.3 billion per year. And I must say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am puzzled about the justification for the two-child limit. It presumably reflects a belief that parents should not have more than 2 children. But I don't think that is the government's view, as far as I can understand it. Indeed, members opposite are starting to worry, understandably, about our falling birth rate. So why do we refuse to provide support for children beyond the first 2? Isn't it now time just to scrap that limit, which doesn't really seem to make any sense? Another reason for higher DWP expenditure this year is the continuation of cost of living support. Expenditure is forecast to increase by just over £2 billion this year through higher payments, £900 in this financial year compared to £650 last, and also higher take-up. The payments have been crucial, but they do not fully meet need. In particular, the £150 disability support payment. Maddie Rose of MENCAP told the Select Committee last month that it is clearly not commensurate with the extra cost that those eligible incur, and we've heard some strong evidence along those lines to the committee. Helen Barnard of the Trussell Trust told the committee last month it has certainly helped the families that have got it, these cost of living payments, but of course it is a flat payment. It is not calibrated for the number of people you are trying to feed. So it has clearly gone less far if you're a family with children than if you're a single person or a couple. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is one of the reasons why the Trussell Trust data shows a faster rise in food bank demand amongst families with children than among families without. The lump sum nature of the payment is problematic. Citizens Advice, speaking for many, told the committee that increments to universal credit would be better than one-off payments. Our colleagues in the Treasury Select Committee called on the government last December for monthly payments over a 6-month period to give more household support at the time of their greatest need and to reduce the severity of the disincentives to work. The government rejected that proposal, essentially due to the limitations of the IT system, but as we know from the pandemic, monthly universal credit can be increased overnight. The need to meet a specific qualifying period for each payment window has led to what evidence to the committee has described as a cliff edge, where receiving a nil universal credit award 1 month, perhaps due to a sanction or a higher salary, due to back pay or a bonus, those cause recipients to become ineligible for the entire cost of living support payment in that qualification period. I am looking forward to discussing cost of living support further with the Minister's colleague, the Minister for Social Mobility, Youth and Progression at the committee tomorrow morning. A very important aid, Madam Deputy Speaker, in achieving effective spending is transparency over how the money is being spent and what is being achieved. The department has had a very poor record in recent years, so I do warmly welcome signs of a new commitment to transparency since the appointment of the new Secretary of State. Keeping things hidden, which has been the department's practice, has the short-term advantage for ministers of avoiding them having to answer sometimes awkward questions. But over the medium and long term, people depending on the department form the impression that it is conspiring against them. The result is terrible mistrust, causing the department over time very serious problems. And for example, the very serious lack of confidence in the DWP amongst disabled people at the moment. It doesn't have to be like that, but changing things requires deliberate effort on the department's behalf. None of the recently introduced employment support initiatives had regular performance reporting on introduction. I warmly welcome the Minister's announcement of 6 monthly performance reports for Restart. That is one of the signs of welcome change in the department's approach. But that should be the norm, part of the arrangements built in at the outset, not something that has to be dragged kicking and screaming from the department subsequently. Greater openness could deliver a wholly different relationship between the department and the people depending on its services. where the department is seen to be working with those it's serving rather than conspiring against them. An interesting suggestion in the Child Poverty Action Group report, which I referred to earlier, You Reap What You Code, is that the source code for the Universal Credit Computer System should be published. Now, there would no doubt be some security concerns about doing that, but couldn't perhaps a small team with experts from disability groups, citizens' advice, with software experts be charged with reviewing that software, having a look at it and proposing improvements, maybe in an annual report, perhaps a little bit along the lines of what the Social Security Advisory Committee does elsewhere at the moment. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me just say briefly a word about a different aspect of the committee's work. We've been worried by the cuts to the funding for the Health and Safety Executive. One result has been drastically fewer inspections of workplace asbestos. We published a report on this last year and called in particular for two things: a target to remove all workplace asbestos within 40 years, together with a plan to deliver it, and a central digital register of all workplace asbestos and of its condition. The government rejected those recommendations, though I do welcome the agreement of the Minister's colleague, to meet a group of us together with 3 industry groups and the Health and Safety Executive to discuss further the idea for a register. That meeting will take place, I think, later on this month. But I do very warmly welcome the launch of the campaign by the Sunday Times at the weekend, drawing attention to the continuing scale of the tragedy being inflicted by asbestos even now, a quarter of a century after its use was banned. It's still the biggest source of workplace-related deaths. And the Sunday Times campaign headlines in particular our 2 recommendations, and I do hope that ministers will now recognise the need to act. And I welcome the fact that the Sunday Times is going to be running this campaign, I think, on a consistent basis. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do want to thank again the Backbench Business Committee for recommending today's debate. I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister specifically how ministers are assessing whether the different cost of living support payments meet needs and whether they're reaching the right people, and also how and when ministers will decide whether payments along these lines will be needed next year. And I look forward to the debate we're about to have.
Winder Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to follow the Chairman of the Select Committee this afternoon. This is an opportunity for us to scrutinise the spending of DWP as a whole, and I think it is important to reflect, as the Chair of the Select Committee did, on the amounts of money that we are talking about here. Spending on pensioner benefits equates to £134.8 billion. Spending on universal credit and equivalent benefits equates to £82.8 billion. And that's before we look at disability and carers benefits, housing benefits, incapacity benefits and the one-off cost of living payments. This is a significant amount of money that we're talking about. And we're not just talking about it in the whole and in the round, but I'm sure all of us here today as constituency MPs know that casework associated with DWP takes up a significant proportion of our casework team's times. And frankly, that's usually because of errors in the system. We know that every constituent's circumstances are unique, but the themes are the same and the consequences on people's day-to-day lives and living circumstances can be significant. And I'll highlight today a survey carried out by the WASPI campaign that reports that nearly 1 in 3 women who have been impacted by changes to the state pension have fallen into debt in the last 6 months. That is people's day-to-day lives. But given the amount of money spent on the DWP, I think we all, on a cross-party basis, would want the money that is spent to be used effectively and efficiently. And I do want to use my time this afternoon to highlight some of the inefficiencies in the system and seek updates from the Minister that I hope he will address in his concluding remarks. In terms of the state pension, I think it's important that we recognise that those who are most reliant on the state pension are those who are least able to work for longer. And I want to highlight the current LEAP correction exercise of underpayments on the state pension and ask the Minister to confirm whether the Government is still on track to complete those corrections by the end of 2024. In February 2023, they had only paid out 200 million of the target 1.5 billion. I also want to highlight the uptake on pension credit. The IFS has advised that there is a policy proposal on the table that is looking at combining housing allowance and the pension credit systems. They believe that it will see an increased uptake in pension credit, and I know that's something the Pension Minister has been working very hard to do. If that is the case, why is that potentially being pushed back to 2028? Homes responsibility protection errors. This was discovered last year and mentioned in the DWP's annual report, and what that meant was that when people had accrued HRP under the old state pension, there were errors in converting to the national insurance credits in the move to the new system, and that left people with incomplete records and underpayments. And when I say people, Madam Deputy Speaker, generally women. We are still waiting for the report to set out the scale of the problem now and how they plan to fix it. And I would be grateful again if the Minister could mention when that correction exercise will start. And I would urge that it starts in parallel to the current correction and not be delayed until after the current exercise is finished. And again, I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, a lot of these issues tend to be around women, and it does feel to me that sometimes the systems are set up that doesn't recognise the way that women have been in the workplace, the decisions that they make for family and other reasons, and for caring responsibilities. I also want to touch on missing national insurance credits for people who received universal credit. I know the Minister confirmed to myself in a letter in March that the automatic system for updating the records didn't work because the format of the UC data being sent into HMRC didn't work with their systems and was suspended, and that has meant that NI records are being manually updated with errors as a result being made. And I think this ties in with the Chair of the Select Committee's comments around IT and the problems sometimes that legacy systems have. I think we all remember when we talk about the £20 uplift to universal credit, the fact that that uplift was never seen for those on legacy benefits, and the initial reasons given for that was because the IT systems couldn't cope, and it was never addressed. But on that NI records, again, if I can ask the Minister, do we think that all those corrections will be made by the end of 23-24, and can we have any update on the number of pensioners who are still missing out on their full entitlements? Madam Deputy Speaker, if I can move on briefly to private pensions. Before I do so, I think it is really important that if we are wanting work to work, and are wanting effectively, we have to acknowledge that that we need to do more around pensions. And I think a very startling statistic for me is the fact that most people are not in work the year before their pension age. So for a variety of reasons, people are not working and therefore waiting for their state pension. But on private pensions, recent DWP reporting has put the gender pension gap for private pensions at a staggering 35%. And I wonder if the Government has an estimate of the gender pay gap if they included people who had no private pension entitlement at all, because I suspect if that has not been included, the gap will be somewhat larger. Mm-hmm. And will they make it a departmental statutory objective to close the gender pension gap? We're back to women here, Madam Deputy Speaker. That changing portfolio careers that potentially women have experienced, I think are increasingly going to be the case for many, many people. I think about my own background in terms of before I came into this place. Increasingly people do not stay in organisations for 30 plus years and draw down their pension from that organisation. They are doing a variety of different jobs in a variety of different places, and as a result of that, the pensions dashboard that was passed in the Pensions Act, it becomes even more critical for people to keep a track, and I'd be grateful again for an update from the Minister on the rollout of that. But I'll come back to benefits and insufficiency of income. A number of us were present at the statement in relation to the disability cost of living payment, and I think there was a general acknowledgement, certainly on this side, that insufficiency of income is at the root of that. The Resolution Foundation estimates that in relation to costs, in 2021 DWP data shows that 1 in 6 people were in relative poverty and 1 in 5 after accounting for housing costs. 13% were in absolute poverty and 17% after housing costs. And as I say, the Resolution Foundation estimates that this is going to go up in 23-24 to after housing costs to 18.4%. We know that keeping people in poverty has negative outcomes. When people are financially insecure, they're more likely to have health problems, more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to struggle to get into work. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I would echo the comments of the Chair of the Select Committee in relation to the uprating of benefits. The uprating previously, which was welcomed, was simply to keep up with inflation. If the problem is an insufficiency of income, not committing to do that going forward just makes the problem worse. I'm co-chair of the Ending the Need for Food Banks all-party parliamentary group, and our cash and food inquiry talks specifically around how we better support and ensure that we see a decrease in use for food banks. But from my own constituency's perspective, and indeed this is something the Scottish Affairs Select Committee are looking at, the rural poverty premium is real. And when we think about transport costs, as the Chair of Select Committee adhered to, I know from the East Newcombe, my constituency, going to the job centre in Leven is £9 on the bus. And when we're talking about the small amounts of money that do constitute universal credit, you can very quickly see where that money goes, and that's before you're shopping in premium local shops, potentially, as opposed to your Aldi and Lidl. Money goes very, very quickly. Happy to give way to Honourable.
Honourable Lady's made a very good point about benefits, and the key part that benefits have in creating a wealthy society. She may or may not know there's an interesting TED talk, where in the world is it easiest to get rich? And it's in actually Norway, Sweden and Denmark, where they've identified that one of the key aspects of creating a wealthy society is a good benefit system that enables workers to go around with some security, and society and children to have security as well. So if you want to have millionaires and billionaires, you need a very, very good benefit system.
Thank the Honourable Member for his contribution. Absolutely, I think we all look to Scandinavian countries in terms of their quality of life and how they support individuals, and I think we have to think more about how we can better support that. And indeed, the public generally tend to support that. They are comfortable paying potentially more in tax to have better services, and I think that's a debate that needs to continue to be had. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to touch briefly on carers. I'm very pleased that my Carers Leave Private Members Bill is now the Carers Leave Act and will for the first time give employment rights to unpaid carers. But one of the huge challenges, and I've said this in the Chamber before, when I was engaging with people in my constituency who were unpaid carers, was the number of people who had left work because of their caring responsibilities and therefore would not benefit from the provisions in the bill. And that's sadly a fact for too many. We see too many unpaid carers and the people they are caring for living in poverty. Carers UK estimate that unpaid carers are providing care worth £162 billion a year, and when we contrast that with the costs of this department through the estimates debate, you can see the comparators. Without them, our economy would be severely strained. 45% are estimated to be unable to afford their monthly expenses, and when we look specifically at carers receiving carers allowance or universal credit carer element, 2/3 say that they cannot meet their monthly expenses. I've called for this before, I'll continue to call for it. The level of carers allowance needs urgently increasing, and we need to think about how we taper carers allowance. The caring never stops. We should not have people falling off a cliff edge in terms of hours work, because frankly it's a disincentive in people going into work, because if they've got the choice between working or caring for their loved one, they are going to choose caring for their loved one every single time. And on young carers, I really am concerned, not just in terms of their education, but the fact that we will never get them into the workplace if we are not providing them the support in which to get there. And then finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very conscious that for some unpaid carers, they take the decision to step out of the workplace for some time, and then their caring responsibility ends, potentially through the loss of a loved one. What are we doing to support unpaid carers who potentially have been out of the workplace for some time back into work? There are similarities there with issues such as parental leave and other decisions too. I think we should be looking at that body of people who, frankly, are some of the best multitaskers I know, and the skill sets that they have to help them into work. The final thing I want to raise, Madam Deputy Speaker, is an issue that potentially other members won't be hugely aware of, but I just want to briefly mention child benefit thresholds, because I think this is becoming an increasing problem, particularly given some of our frozen rates of income tax levels. It's a ticking time bomb. Families don't apply for child benefit if they know that they won't be entitled to it. But because those levels have never changed, it's increasingly an issue for stay-at-home parents, again, usually women, there's a theme, who then miss out on accruing national insurance credits for the state pension because they don't realise that if they don't apply for the child benefit payment, even to be told that they don't apply, they cannot then pick up the national insurance credits, and that can be a real issue. So I'd ask the Minister consider reviewing the scheme for accruing credits for stay-at-home parents, or at the very least doing an awareness-raising campaign as they have done for pension credits and others. This is a good opportunity, whether you've got an interest via the Select Committee or otherwise, but as a constituency MP for me, I want, and I know my casework team want, the DWP to be working as effectively as possible so that those that need help get it and those that can get into work are supported to do so. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Debbie Abrams.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow on from the member for North East Fife, and I particularly find myself resonating with her comments in relation to carers and what lack of support there is in so many different ways, but particularly through the social security system. The billions, the multiple billions that are provided in equivalent support to this country that we sadly do not adequately recognise. I also want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, for all that he does in the plethora of different inquiries that the Select Committee has had over the last few years, and particularly I'm very pleased about the work that we're doing on the adequacy or not of the social security system, and the importance I think that will reveal when it's published in the early stages of next year. But to get back to why we're here, and this is obviously looking at DWP spending, and obviously associated with that is on what this means in relation to the department's and particularly the government's priorities for social security as a whole. And I want to focus my remarks particularly in relation to the drop, the fall in support for working age adults. I think we need to recognise this particular group and the impact that this is having on so many different families across the country. Obviously we've had two major welfare reform acts in 2012 and 2016, and I'll come on to refer to the latter one in a moment, but the cumulative impact of those up to the pandemic was the equivalent of a 17% reduction in working age support, which in cash terms was about £33 billion. Now this was only slightly offset by the temporary increase in universal credit during the pandemic. And although I welcome the uprating that occurred last year and support absolutely what my right honourable friend said about this, it doesn't make up at all for, as I say, the last 10, 11 years of significant cuts. And of course that's had an impact on relative poverty across the UK. 1 in 3 children, just under 1 in 3 children are growing up in poverty. In my constituency that's nearly 1 in 2. We also know that just under 2/3 of children growing up in poverty live in families where there is at least one adult who's working. So the implications for these children are not insignificant. We have now the highest level of in-work poverty that we've ever had. what on earth does that say about this country? It really is quite shocking. And then many people who know me will know that I have particularly feel very strongly in terms of the impact of these cuts on disabled people. 1 in 3 disabled people are living in poverty. That's twice as much as the rate for non-disabled people. It's just totally unacceptable. Our most vulnerable people in our society, and we're failing to recognise and support their needs. Now, I know the Minister will come back and say, oh, well, actually, poverty has reduced, and JRF, in terms of that annual report that they came out with at the beginning of the year, reflected that. Yes, poverty levels have gone down, and that reflected that during the pandemic, we saw reductions in overall incomes, and obviously in terms of relative poverty, that's the position there. But very importantly, they also say, but it was also about different choices that the government made at the time. So, as much, you know, as we're talking about now, we must recognise that £20 a week additional support made a difference in those poverty levels. So poverty is not inevitable. It is about political choices, and again, I hope that we can reflect on that. So when I speak to my Oldham East and Saddleworth constituents, indeed people across the country, they tell me that they feel our current system no longer provides the safety net it was set up to do in the post-war settlement with the British people. And they're right, it's inadequate. Following on from their first-hand experience during the pandemic, polling shows that 2/3 of Britons think that universal credit is just too low. Not only has the adequacy of the UK social security system diminished over time, in terms of average weekly incomes, currently it's approximately half of what was provided after World War II. But it's also lower than most of our European neighbours, with data from 2018 showing that our social security spending as a percentage of GDP was below that both of the EU 27 and of the OECD averages. We must never forget that the post-war Labour government created both the NHS and the welfare state. And as we mark the remarkable achievement of our NHS and its 75th anniversary tomorrow, we must reflect on the principles of universality and access for all. And I'd like to say that I would like to see this reflected in what we want to see in our social security system as well. So for me, I believe that, like our NHS, our social security system should also be there for all of us in our time of need, whether that's as a result of illness or disability, or whether it's that we aren't able to work anymore because we've reached retirement age, or for any other reason. It should provide basic financial support and should be valued for the safety net it provides. That's not the case now. That's why I'm advocating for a new social contract that defines the future of our social security system. A good starting point for this is the Essentials Guarantee that my Right Honourable friend was just talking about. And that's been proposed by the Trussell Trust and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but it is a wide coalition of charities that have advocated for this. They found that 90% of low-income households on universal credit are going without essentials such as food, electricity and clothes. This inadequacy is the main driver of food bank need, with almost 1.3 million food parcels distributed between April and September 22. I mean, this is just unacceptable in the 5th richest country in the world. An Essentials Guarantee ensures that Universal Credit Standard Allowance meets a level that provides basic security for a family's need. For a single person, they calculated this at £120 a week, and for the standard allowance, and for a couple at £200 a week. This guarantee would bring us in line with our European neighbours and provide a safety net in the same vein as our NHS. It will also reduce the poverty that too many are experiencing. For children, this has a lifelong impact. So some of you know that I also chaired the Health and All Policies group and have done for a number of years, and in 2020, or just before the pandemic, we commissioned a review of the 2016 Welfare Reform and Work Act to analyse the impacts that this was having on children and disabled people. And anybody watching or listening is welcome to have a look at that on my website. But I think one of the biggest things and the most worrying things that we found, a figure that we found, was that for every 1% increase in child poverty, there's a significant association with an extra 5.8 infant deaths per 100,000 live births. And about a third of all the increases in infant mortality between 2014 and 2017 could be attributed to this rise in child poverty. Now, this was published in one of the peer-reviewed medical journals, and the impact, the understanding of the impact that that's had on so many families is quite devastating. There is yet further evidence that far more needs to be done to provide an essentials guarantee. So the flip side of that is we know that we have one of the highest levels in terms of tax burden in 40 years. But what I was really heartened to see is that organisations like Patriotic Millionaires in the UK, their members, all multimillionaires, have come out and said, we recognise the impact that not having a wealth tax on us is having on the fabric of our society. We don't want our children growing up in society where there isn't the fairness that we grew up in as a country. And they have come up with a proposal of a wealth tax that would actually fund the essentials guarantee. So I think, for me, they espouse what we as a nation can be. In contrast, I would like to say that there has also been a rather nasty element in the media, and it gets me back to, I think, what we were talking, my honourable friends were talking about in their speeches. If we look at spending the DWP, we must remember that half of our spending, quite rightly, goes on a state pension. That's the biggest source of spending. The next bit is around housing benefits. So, when we need to recognise this, and nobody would criticise money that's going in DWP spending on our pensioners. And I would urge that responsible journalists would also recognise we shouldn't be criticising social security spending going on people who are disabled or not able to work because of illness. We must be better than that. So I repeat, as I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I did promise that I'd be very brief, that poverty...
For clarification, I'm not putting the Honourable Lady under any pressure. As far as I'm concerned, she has all the time in the world.
Well, that is definitely an offer I will refuse this time. But I just want to repeat, as I said before, poverty and inequality are not inevitable. They are political choices. And I believe that, like our NHS, our social security system should be there for all of us in our time of need. Thank you.
SNP spokesman, David Linden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as others have done, may I start by extending my thanks to the Chair of our Select Committee for securing today's debate and for setting the scene so well. Today's debate takes place against the backdrop of an ongoing Westminster-made cost of living crisis that affects the livelihoods and lives of people right across Scotland and, of course, these islands. And the harsh yet inescapable reality is that people in Scotland can no longer afford to pay the price for the economic mismanagement of a Westminster government it did not elect. Indeed, we have not voted by majority for the Conservatives since 1955. Now, in May, CPI was still 8.7%. Prices are still soaring, and the cost of living under Westminster control is still far too high for many families who are already struggling to get by after 13 long, brutal years of Tory cuts, Brexit and economic mismanagement. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that inflation also disproportionately impacts lower income groups such as single parents, who spend a relatively high proportion of their income on food and fuel. Indeed, new Trussell Trust research shows that families are going hungry as a result of the Westminster-made cost of living crisis, with 1 in 7 people in the UK facing hunger in the last year due to a lack of money. Ministers will often tell us that the reasons for food bank usage is complex. It is not complex, it is because people do not have enough money. Indeed, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's latest cost of living tracker found that 5.7 million low-income households are having to cut down or skip meals because they do not have enough money for food, while the number going without such items such as food, heating or basic toiletries has remained around 7 million for more than a year. All of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the 6th largest economy in the world. Madam Deputy Speaker, the average mortgage rate for a 2-year fixed-term mortgage has risen to 6%, and the Resolution Foundation has said average annual mortgage repayments are set to rise by £2,900 for those renewing next year. In short, that is the eye-watering Westminster mortgage premium that Scots are paying for the pleasure of a Tory government that they did not elect. And what's more, analysis by the consumer group Which shows that the prices of popular family meals have risen by 27% over the last year, all the while the Irish and French governments have reached agreements with major supermarket retailers to reduce food prices, whilst this Tory government is sitting on their hands. And it's those low-income families in Parkhead, Shettleston and Baillieston, who I represent, that are paying the price for the sheer intransigence of Conservative ministers here in London. And so even at this late hour in the cost of living crisis, I would still urge the British Government to use all of the powers at its disposal to tackle the cost of living crisis on the scale that is required. And yes, that does mean the government will have to be bold, it means that the government will have to be radical, and the same is true of the pro-Brexit Labour Party. Now, I want to turn now specifically to universal credit, which is obviously the main focus of today's debate. In short, the continual refusal of the British Government to fix the extensive and known about problems with universal credit is unacceptable, and it is without doubt subjecting some of the most vulnerable people in our communities to additional and unnecessary hardship. I do think that there is an opportunity now where the 3 main parties in this place now agree with the principles of universal credit, and so I think we should be putting our heads together to look at what we can do to fix it. So I'll start with the level of universal credit. GRF research shows that support has eroded over decades, and the basic rate of universal credit is now at its lowest level as a proportion of average earnings. Indeed, in the GRF latest cost of living tracker, the research in that warns that around 9 in 10 low-income households on UC have gone without at least one essential for the 3rd survey in over a year. And for most people referred to food banks in the Trussell Trust network, the design and delivery of the social security system are major contributors to their inability to afford the essentials. The majority, indeed some 89% of people referred to food banks in the Trussell Trust network receive a means-tested benefit such as universal credit, but this did not provide enough to cover the costs of the essentials. And some honourable friend from East Ham was saying the House will be aware that GRF, together with the Trussell Trust, is calling upon ministers to implement that essentials guarantee to ensure that at a very minimum the basic rate of universal credit at least covers life's essentials, and that support can never be pulled below that level. I'm very happy to give way to my honourable friend from Glasgow.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Isn't another problem this insane part of the system where people pay back money because of advances and the level of deductions, where over £60 a month is being deducted from his constituents and my constituents' universal credit, and that envelopes that cycle of poverty.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend from Glasgow South West for putting that point on record. He was, of course, my predecessor on the Select Committee and follows this work very well. I'm going to come on actually to the issue of debt and deductions, because it is one of the big issues that is raised in terms of the evidence that the Select Committee receives, and certainly in terms of the stakeholders that we meet. So he's absolutely spot on to put that on the record and draw attention to that £60 for each of our constituents that is recouped by the government and that could be spent in our local economies. He's spot on that. Madam Deputy Speaker, new CPAG research finds that the digital aspects of universal credit routinely lead to wrong amounts being awarded to claimants, often the most vulnerable, into breaches of rule of law principles. And that is why I have repeatedly called on the government to reverse its cut to universal credit and working tax credits. And let's not forget that that was the biggest overnight cut to welfare in 70 years, inflicting hardship for people who are already struggling. And I think to have done so as we come out the teeth of a pandemic, it was particularly cruel, I've got to say. I also want to say to the government, rather than offering one-off payments to shore up the incomes of struggling families, I believe that the Department of Work and Pensions should reverse the damaging policies that are impacting on the most vulnerable. They should reinstate the UC uplift at £25 per week and, of course, extend it to legacy benefits. Let's not forget the 2.5 million disabled people so ably advocated for by my honourable friend from Oldham East and Saddleworth were cruelly left behind during the pandemic, during that uplift. The government also needs to remove the benefit cap and the two-child limit with its associated rate clause, and also halt the punitive sanctions regime so that all households are lifted out of poverty now and in the future. I want to turn now to the benefit cap a bit more, because, as the Poverty Alliance points out, the way that the benefit cap is designed means that those who require the highest level of support from the benefit system are actually the most likely to be affected. That is, Madam Deputy Speaker, simply unjust. And based on the latest departmental figures, 114,000 UK households have had their benefit capped. 86% of them are families with children. Indeed, the benefit cap disproportionately impacts lone parent families, the majority of whom are women, and I think that's a point that was made by my honourable friend from North East Fife, as well as, of course, larger families and indeed ethnic minority families. And the same is true of the two-child limit as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, thousands of families with children will be pushed into poverty because ministers on the Treasury bench refuse to scrap the two-child limit on child tax credits and universal credit. And a new LSE study found that the policy's impoverishment of larger low-income households has helped few parents get a job. Instead, its main function has been to push families further into poverty and to damage their mental health. So I really do wonder why ministers are so furrowed to this idea of the two-child limit, which I know that the vast majority of them are actually quite embarrassed by, and that's before you get to the associated rate clause, or as the government likes to call it, the non-consensual sex exemption. When this government goes around lecturing people about the values of global Britain, I'm pretty sure it doesn't go around and tell folk that the state decides that it will only support the first two children in a family, but if someone can prove that their child was born as a result of rape, then that's okay. And I see the PPS is shaking his head at that. It's probably because he's so embarrassed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the 5-week wait for a first payment is also needlessly pushing people into hardship. We know this issue could be easily fixed by implementing the SNP's proposals to turn advance payment loans into non-repayable grants after a claimant has been deemed eligible. The Trussell Trust that I referenced earlier has consistently shown that the 5-week wait for universal credit is a key driver in the need for food banks, both during that 5 weeks and after the payments have started. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to draw attention to the young parent penalty, because I believe that ministers must end the young parent penalty in UC.
which denies single parents under 25 years old the same level of social security as those above that age, and it pushes those affected into real poverty. Let's not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, when 25-year-olds go into, or under 25s, go into Aldi, Lidl or Morrison's or whatever supermarket they go to, they don't get a discount on the shopping because they're under 25. And so I do find that the Minister's obsession... Yes, I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. I know that this is something he's campaigned on, as have I. Does he agree with me that the response I received from the previous Secretary of State on this point, that the reason why under 25s were treated differently was because they tended to still be at home with their parents, is a pretty spurious argument and excuse from this department?
Yes, I do actually agree with that. I think that's right. And you know, the previous Secretary of State wasn't unusual in terms of saying some things that perhaps after a period of scrutiny you might think don't necessarily make sense. But she's right, and for ministers to somehow hide behind the fact that the housing crisis that has been caused by this Tory government is somehow justification for ensuring that young people who are under 25 get lesser support, I think really does not stand up to scrutiny. And it was a point that was actually hammered home to me just on Friday, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I was in Drumchapel visiting the Christians Against Poverty Debt Centre to meet with the staff and volunteers there, who I pay enormous tribute to for their sterling work. And according to One Parent Families Scotland, the result of the young parent penalty is that young couple parents are around £100 worse off per month, and single parents are around £65 off worse off a month than over 25s. And that research from OPFS found that 55% of children with a mum under 25 are in relative poverty and 49% in absolute poverty. Let us never forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, as we are considering those statistics, that is a result of the structural inequality that is put in place by intransigent ministers. And whilst I certainly welcome the change that people in UC will now be able to claim childcare support up front, it doesn't, I'm afraid, change the fundamental issues that the amount of UC that people are in receipt of is simply not enough. Families will still be required to make up the 15% shortfall in their overall childcare costs under UC rules. And one thing which continues to come up in evidence at the Select Committee is that far too many households are facing destitution because of DWP rules pushing them into debt through sanctions and deductions, a point that was made very eloquently, I thought, by a member friend from Glasgow South West. And Aberlour Children's Charity produced a report that states that half of families with children in Scotland receiving universal credit are having their incomes reduced by the DWP to cover debts to public bodies. And I think this is something that I would hope the Select Committee be able to drill into a bit more. But it is something that is increasingly becoming a problem, and I'm sure that I'm not the only MP that's seeing people raising this on a regular basis at FICE surgeries. Now, it is well established and indeed on the record that we on these benches completely oppose the widespread use of sanctions, as there is clear evidence that they do not work. Indeed, evidence from the Department's own report also admits that sanctions have a minimal effect on moving people into work. Instead, we know that people who are sanctioned end up earning less than those who haven't been sanctioned, or simply become economically inactive. I'm happy to give it on the lady.
Friend for giving way, he's making such important remarks. Would he agree with me that also the impact of sanctions is very detrimental on people's mental health? We're facing a mental health crisis. If we want to support people getting into work, we need to make sure that they're not struggling on the breadline.
Borough West is spot on, and this is a problem that I think sometimes ministers overlook, is that actually when you take these decisions, and yes, they might be driven by focus groups and all these kind of things, but the reality is it's the state that bears the cost anyway, because if someone hits a period of mental ill health or they are made homeless, the reality is it's either the health service or the local authority that has to pick up the pieces. So this is not something that is without cost for the state. And I would like for ministers just to have that slightly wider picture as they pursue this, because I think we know that sanctions, particularly the research, shows that it just does not work. And yes, I'm happy to give you again.
way. He's being very generous. Would he also agree with me that the issue of poverty is so concerning around small children because we know that it impacts on the development of the brain and how well they're going to be able to learn? And if you give a child good 5 years at the start of their life, that will see them through life. But so many children are desperately in poverty, unable to know whether they're going to get enough food, and they're also in receipt of all the anxiety that their parents are in as they're battling with this very stressful situation.
Very proud, for example, that the Scottish Government invests in things like the Best Start grant, the baby box, those free school meals, to ensure that young people do get that best start as possible in life. But in Scotland, we've just started in the school holidays, and my own local authority in Glasgow is spending millions of pounds on holiday hunger programmes to ensure that those children who would receive free school meals during the school term time are still being fed. And I think that is a damning indictment on the state, that we're having to spend money from local authority budgets feeding children because their parents don't have enough money. That is the situation that we're in, the 5th richest economy in the world. Now, remarkably, and I'm sure as we'll hear when he closes the debate, ministers are still insisting on forcing more people into the sanctions regime, which further demonstrates a fundamental issue with the British government's attitude towards those on low incomes, preventing vulnerable families from receiving the social security that they're entitled to, and most importantly, when they need it most. And as I begin to draw my remarks and close it, I want to just turn now to local housing allowance, because the freeze of LHA rates for 3 consecutive years is placing additional and needless pressure on tenants and indeed housing associations, and is likely, Madam Deputy Speaker, to increase poverty and inequality. That's why ministers should, I believe, protect household incomes and support renters by restoring LHA rates to the 30th percentile as a very minimum. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the SNP have long called for the British Government to fix these fundamental flaws in our social security system, but as so often it appears to fall on deaf ears each and every time, to the extent that every time I take part in one of these debates, it feels like Groundhog Day. And the blunt truth is that the Scottish Government cannot change these policies whilst 85% of welfare expenditure and income replacement benefits remain reserved to this institution here in London. And that, of course, does include universal credit. And so, yes, by all means, I am happy to take part in debates and make suggestions about how we repair the social security system. But it is difficult to conclude anything other than Westminster, whether it is the Tories or the pro-Brexit Labour Party, have zero appetite to genuinely step in and sort a system that is failing some of the most vulnerable people in society. And so it's for that reason that I believe that the only way that we can genuinely bring about that compassionate, that fair, that dignified social security system in Scotland is with the full powers of independence. And frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, it cannot come soon enough.
Shadow Minister Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This has been a good and important and timely debate, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, for bringing this debate before the House today. He rightly opened up our debate, placing in context the size of the department, the central place it has at the heart of economic policy, and discussed the work of his committee, which has been substantial in looking into some of the very significant flaws of the department. And I think that given the economic situation the country now faces, the work of the committee has never been more important. They have, as he mentioned, published some very important and significant reviews, some of whose recommendations have been adopted by government. So I applaud him for bringing this debate, and also my honourable friend for Oldham East and Saddleworth, who in her usual way explained the manner in which poverty harms people, not just in their financial life, but in every single aspect of their life. And I think the government would do well to listen to her. I want to make some brief remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, emphasis on the brief, as many good points have already been made, and I will not be repeating them all. I want to make some very brief remarks just to get to the heart of the points that has been discussed, particularly on universal credit. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been in this House long enough to remember a country before universal credit and to be able to compare and contrast the system that we had before versus the one that we have got now. And I would just make this reflection based on that experience. Universal credit on its introduction was claimed to be a kind of universal cure-all that would release everyone from the so-called trap of poverty. I didn't think that that was going to be true when it was introduced, and I don't think it's true now, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I think the Department for Work and Pensions, in what it does, both in terms of its spending and also its policy choices, has to be far more than just universal credit, than just social security, important though that is. Because the Department for Work and Pensions, as much as the pension side of it is a huge part of its spending and very important, must also be the Department for Dignity, both the dignity of work and the dignity of well-functioning, decent social protection. And those two areas of policy must work hand in hand to make sure that the ups and downs of life don't upend life chances when unfortunate things happen. We should be using good work and social protection to help people move on and move up in life. And I think the Chair of the Select Committee and other members, Madam Deputy Speaker, has given a good survey on what is happening to the department at the moment. And I would argue that both on work and social protection, we are failing in both areas at the moment. On work, Madam Deputy Speaker, put it simply, we've got fewer people in work now than before the pandemic. I think that cannot be a success. We've got businesses crying out for staff, yet our employment rate hasn't recovered from the pandemic, unlike in other countries. I think that's a huge failure. Pay, the money in people's pockets, has been stagnant for the past decade. So when we think about the promises of universal credit and all that the department does, I would like to ask the Minister, what questions has he asked about that? What research has he commissioned to get underneath why pay is so stagnant? We've had reviews of in-work progression. The government has claimed to want to tackle our productivity crisis. But what research has the DWP actually published to show why, despite the claims made about universal credit and it supporting people escaping the so-called poverty trap that they felt previous governments had created, what evidence do they have to show why we have had such stagnant levels of pay? I think it's arguable that the department's policy choices may have exacerbated the labour market crisis, and I would ask the Minister again, what policies does he have now, today, that are going to help people escape low-paid work? Because for all that the government has talked about the possibilities of universal credit, I would simply ask him, why has it delivered so very little in terms of the money in people's pockets and their chances of getting on? Has universal credit really delivered all that was promised? And I think on those areas, on work incentives, on the chances that families have to do better, on pay progression, and on supporting employers to get the skilled staff that they need, I look at all the department does and I have many questions about where the promised success has disappeared to. And next on work, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've had a series of failed employment schemes, Kickstart, which failed to deliver what it said it would. We've heard from members about Restart and the Work and Health Programme and all that we don't know about what they are doing. And again, I would ask the Minister, if looking at the labour market and all that the Bank of England has said about the consequences for our economy of the state of the labour market today, does he really believe that the Department for Work and Pensions is helping, or is it a hindrance? And I would love to hear him talk about published evidence that the department's policies are actually helping. And finally on work, we know that one of the major challenges our economy has is the imbalanced nature of our labour market. Whilst we have businesses crying out for staff right across the country in many towns, we do have an unemployment challenge. We have some towns and cities across our country that have areas where unemployment is twice the national average. How can that be right in a country that has such a need for staff? And does the Minister really believe that his department's spending and policy choices are really helping that? Work should be the way that all of us achieve our hopes and ambitions, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I just wish the Department for Work and Pensions was a government department that was up to those ambitions. And on social security, as many people have described, it should be the backstop that puts a floor beneath families. Yet, at almost every step over the past decade, the Conservative government have made this harder. At every turn, the political turbulence they have created has had an economic cost for our country as a whole and for families up and down the country, because the inflation we are now facing makes life harder for everybody, but not equally harder. If we look at the money that families must find now to put food on the table, to pay their bills, we know that the choices made by the Tories have made life harder for those who were already finding it tough. Their failings on energy has made life much harder, particularly for people with disabilities, Madam Deputy Speaker, who pay significant extra costs. And it is a well-evidenced phenomenon that people who face illness or disability have significant challenges with the rising costs of energy, and I don't believe that the Conservative government have ever taken their needs into account enough. And I would agree with comments that have been made by both my colleagues from the Select Committee that the relationship between the department and people with disabilities in our country now is not nearly good enough to achieve what we would wish to for people with disabilities. So the evidence of failure, Madam Deputy Speaker, is all around us, whether it is the open doors of food banks or whether it is the closed doors of businesses who have been unable to survive this crisis of inflation and staff shortages. The evidence is all around us. The crisis that we face in housing, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would bet anything, not that I'm a betting woman, but I would nonetheless bet anything that almost every member in this House now has had their housing caseload, even those with a relatively low caseload, has seen it rise in relation to the recent housing crisis. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I look at the accounts of the Department for Work and Pensions, one fact above all else shines out, and it is the rising level of ill health in this country that is having economic consequences for all of us and disastrous consequences for people who are trying to earn money to keep their family housed and fed. And I would say to the Minister, the Tories have not only been not up to the challenge over the past decade or more, they've actively made it worse.
Minister Guy Opperman. Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is an honour once again to present the case on behalf of the Department of Work and Pensions at the Estimate Day debate. I have lost track of the number of times I have done this, but it is in my 7 years at the department, it is on a number of occasions. It is, first of all, my privilege to thank all the Department of Work and Pensions staff, who I regard as a massive help, not a hindrance, as some might have suggested, for the fantastic work they do up and down the country. It is also it is also the case, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have never paid more for the pensions that the government supports in this country. We've never paid more for the benefit support that we provide in this country. We've never paid more for the housing support that we provide in this country. Indeed, we've never paid more for the disabled in this country. And it is absolutely the case that as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the National Health Service, I also want to put on record my thanks to the NHS. I have had my life 2 times saved by the NHS, once after I collapsed in Central Lobby in 2011. I got into politics because of trying to save my local hospital, and I'm proud to have visited Hexham Hospital this week to see the amazing new maternity suite that has recently been opened. Madam Deputy Speaker, there was much that was raised on a variety of issues, but I want to try and contextualise this debate with a situation whereby the government clearly understands the pressures that households are facing. We are all familiar with the causes and the global factors that are the roots behind costs being higher, whether that is the illegal war in Ukraine brought about by Putin, or the aftermath and the consequences of the pandemic, the furlough scheme and the support that this country set out in great detail at the time of difficulty. We are committed to delivering on our priority, which is to halve inflation, which will help ease those pressures for everybody and raise living standards. And alongside this work, it is fair and right to set out that we continue to implement a significant package of cost of living measures to support the most vulnerable during 2023-2024. We've increased benefits and state pensions by 10.1%, raised the benefit cap by the same amount so that more people feel the benefit of uprating. For low-paid workers, we've increased the national living wage by 9.7% to £10.42 an hour. This represents an increase of over £1,600 to the gross annual earnings of a full-time worker on the national living wage. This increase and the increases we made to the national minimum wage in April have given a pay rise to around 2.9 million workers. And to help parents, we are delivering a significant expansion of childcare support, which includes the maximum amount of universal credit childcare payments rising by 47%. That is a dramatic increase, as I set out in the House last week. In addition, I will in a second, let me make a little bit of progress, because I have much that I want to try and answer. In addition, where there are gaps in provision, notwithstanding the above cost of living payments, the £842 million extension of our household support fund into 2023-2024 means that councils across England can continue to help families with grocery bills and other essentials. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Giving way, some universal credit claimants are able to can apply to have their housing element of their universal credit paid directly to the landlord. But Child Poverty Action Group have reported that on the discovery phase of managed migration, identified delays or errors in direct payments being set up and poor communication between DWP, landlords and claimants, leading to people falling into arrears. Clearly, that's a really serious state of affairs for anybody to find themselves in. Could he tell us what the government's going to do about this?
Well, I will get the individual minister in respect of that to write to the Honourable Lady with respect. She brings me to the issue of housing, which several colleagues did raise, and I want to try and address that. Members will be aware that in 2022-23, the government are projected to spend £30 billion to support renters. That is 1.4% of GDP. Colleagues may have criticised that sum, but they should be aware that this is the highest of any country in the OECD in relation to spending on house or rental support. The next highest is 0.9% of GDP. Clearly, the figure is higher than when we came into office. And clearly, there is obviously over 2 million additional homes since coming into office, and more homes are meeting decent home standards. I could go on. In respect of employment, it is at 30 million. It is up 23,000 on the month, up 73,000 on the quarter, and with vacancies are down once again, 35,000 down on the month in May, 79,000 on the quarter. I met today with UK Hospitality and a whole host of providers of hospitality at the Department of Work and Pensions to address some of the long-term vacancy issues that they wish to raise, and I believe that we can continue to work with job centres up and down the country to try and address that, and to increase the overall employment rate, which again was the rate was up 0.1% on the month, up 0.2% on the quarter, and with unemployment down 0.1 points on the month as of May. And in respect of economic inactivity, that is also down 0.4 points on the quarter and down 781,000 since the general election on 2010. It is quite clear, of course, that there are impacts of the pandemic, and the progress in certain areas is not as quick as one would like, but I do believe that we are in a position that we have taken huge efforts to turn this around, and all the indications from all the labour market statistics that were released by the ONS in May is that the trends are in the right direction. On cost of living support, No, I won't. I've already given away. Don't believe. On cost of living payments, we are building on and extending the one-off cash payments we provided between 2022 to 2023 that saw us make over £30 million worth of cost of living payments, including the £150 disability cost of living payment to 6 million people, £650 for over 8 million households on means-tested benefits, and an additional £300 on top of the winter fuel payment for over 8 million pensioner households. This puts hundreds of pounds directly and quickly into the pockets of millions of people. Criticism was made of universal credit as a principle, but the first and simple point that I would make, which I think was acknowledged by the chair of the Select Committee, is that the legacy system would in no way have been able to provide the degree of support that it did in COVID, that universal credit did, and the legacy system would in no way be able to provide the ongoing degree of cost of living support. This, as we see, puts a massive amount of support on an ongoing basis, which is targeted to help those most impacted by rising prices throughout this financial year. I've got about a dozen issues that I was going to respond to the Honourable Gentleman, but I will give away once again.
One of them to him. When does he envisage making a decision about whether the cost of living payments will be continued for a further year? When this year is that decision likely to be made?
Well, he will know, because he and I have worked together for many, many years, and I'd like to say it is together, and he will know that I have been a humble junior functionary at the Department for Work and Pensions for a very long period of time, never to rise any higher, and that to address the Honourable Lady, there have been 3 female Secretaries of State who I've had the privilege of serving prior to the present Secretary of State. I think I'm on my 7th Secretary of State. These things are way and monumentally above my pay grade, and I would decided, as I'm sure he knows, having done my job and many other jobs in government by the Chancellor and the Prime Minister at some stage over the course of this coming year. It is a fair point. I have much to be modest about, to be fair. It is a fair point, though, that these matters will be considered, and it is clearly above my pay grade and beyond my knowledge, but obviously there is an autumn statement in November, which would be the clear time for decisions to be telegraphed, if not decisions made. But I am genuinely, it's way above my pay grade. The Honourable Gentleman raised a number of points. I'm going to try and answer some of them in the time I have. On the issue of prison leavers, the Department recognises the need for prisoners and carers to be able to make advance claims to universal credit, and there is a working process in place to support this. And to be fair, I have met with my honourable friend, the Prisons Minister, who is welcoming any questions that follow in the Justice debate, and my honourable friend, the Social Mobility Minister, who looks after most aspects of prisoners, on several occasions to try and drive forward UC take-up. It does require the individual, though, to desire to do that, and that is clearly complicated and not easy, but it is a work in progress, but it is very much something that we are aware of. In respect of the Minister for Social Mobility, I know that she is giving evidence to the Select Committee tomorrow, so I will not address in too much detail the issues he raised on the Health and Safety Executive, which is one of the few briefs I haven't held in the last few years. On the issue of transparency, he rightly raises that, and I would respectfully say that I agree with him. The present Secretary of State has transformed the position in respect of that. He knows my strong view that we should have a, save where we have to do so under labour market statistics on a monthly basis, we should have a 6-monthly situation where we provide the vast plethora of data linked to the 2 fiscal events of the year. But that is a work in progress, which is still ongoing, but the Department is definitely reviewing all aspects of those things. He raised the Flexible Support Fund. The Flexible Support Fund, he raised particular issues about people taking buses to work. I do want to take issue with that, because there is absolutely no doubt that a job centre can use the Flexible Support Fund to support with bus or other transport fares for agreed work-related activity. And if it was the case that this was for a work-related activity, that support can be provided, as it is provided in other contexts, childcare being the one that he will be particularly aware of. And certainly, I would very much hope that the individual job centre that he's referring to would be aware of that. On fraud and error, he will be aware that there is huge amounts of effort being put forward by my honourable friend, the Minister, who takes control of that particular part of the portfolio, and the Secretary of State. In a multitude of different ways, we have a large number of extra staff who have been brought in to address fraud and error. We are also in a position that it has fallen to 3.6% from 4%, according to the latest national statistics, and down from 2.7% compared with 3% in 2021-22. And universal credit losses have again fallen by nearly 2% over the similar period. And we are bluntly trying to crack down on those who are exploiting the benefit system and would make it very, very clear that we are coming after those people who are attempting to exploit the benefit system, because we want to ensure that the maximum amount of support goes to those people who need it. That targeted support includes support for people on means-tested benefits such as universal credit, with up to 3 cost of living payments totalling up to £900. We have delivered the first £301 payment to 8.3 million households, support worth £2.5 billion. The 2 further payments of £300 and £299 will be made in the autumn and next spring. And to help with the additional costs, we have obviously done the disability cost of living payment, which is 6 million people, and the winter fuel support payment. There is a huge amount of work being done in job centres, whether through the in-work progression offer, the support of extra work coaches, the over 50 support, the administrative earnings threshold support, and the 37 new district progression leads who are working with key partners, including local government, employers and skills providers, to identify and develop local opportunities and to overcome barriers that limit progression. The Honourable Lady from North East Fife raised a number of issues in relation to pension matters. Clearly, I continue to defend the actions of the Labour government and the coalition government in respect of the raise in state pension age. In respect of the LEAP exercise that she referred to and the HMRC, both of those are works in progress. I don't believe there is any fundamental change to that which she's been previously advised. And in respect of pension credit, she'll be aware that take-up of applications is in excess of, I think, 170% increased of applications. There is a slight backlog in respect of that, but that is coming down dramatically. And on the gender pension gap, she'll be aware of the changes to the new state pension, which is massively advantageous to women, and also the fact that successive governments, starting with the Turner Commission and the Labour government and the coalition, have brought in automatic enrolment specifically to address that particular issue. And she raised one final point in respect of the change in jobs in later life. I cannot overstate the project that I've only been pressing for now 5.5 years, which is the midlife MOT. I'm delighted to say it is now being rolled out across the country, whether that is online, whether that is in job centres up and down the country, or more particularly in 3 private sector areas of the country where they are trialling the particular processes. If she hasn't got acquainted with that, I would strongly urge her to do so, particularly because in her area of North East Scotland and near Fife, that there is actually a particular providers who I know are providing, I can provide the details of, and Aviva and others are doing very good stuff in that particular place. In respect of the points further made, and I'm conscious that I've been speaking for some time, the practical reality is we believe that we are removing the barriers that stop people from working. We believe that we are reducing the number of people who are economically inactive, and that is progressing over a 5th consecutive month where inactivity has declined. There is, I accept, more to do, and I'm determined to leave no stone unturned in taking the decisive action needed across government to see this downward trend continue. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that we are tackling inflation to help manage the cost of living. We are providing extra support. The economic trends, as shown by the labour market statistics, are heading in the right direction, and with the government's significant package of cost of living support on an ongoing basis, that is worth over £94 billion, in excess of the rises to state pension and benefits. We are protecting those most in need from the worst impact of rising prices, or putting more pounds in people's pockets. And I commend these estimates to the House.
In conclusion, Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me reiterate my thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for enabling us to hold this debate, and I'd like to thank everyone who's taking part in the debate as well. The Honourable Member for North East Fife spoke in this debate last year as well, I'm pleased to say, and I wanted to pick up one point she made about the gender pensions gap. I agree with her in welcoming the fact that the Pensions Minister has now come forward with a definition of that, so we know what we're talking about, but I also agree with her we need to have a target to reduce it, and I hope that we will see that coming forward in due course as well. My honourable friend from Oldham East and Saddlewell, I do want to thank her very much for all her work on the committee and her very committed work on behalf of disabled people, and she talked in her speech this afternoon about the scourge of disability poverty and some of the things that we need to do to tackle that. The Honourable Member for Glasgow East, I'm grateful to him for combining his work on the committee with his front bench role. He makes a very valuable contribution to the work of the committee. Can I just pick up and endorse the tribute that he made to the work of the organisation Christians Against Poverty, which I think is very valuable and doing a very impressive job all over the country. And I'm grateful for the interventions that we've had. My honourable friend, the member for Wirral West, and the honourable member for Glasgow South West. Good to see him back on this beat. And the honourable member for Na Ailian Anil as well. But to the Minister, let me just say I'm grateful to him for suggesting that perhaps the autumn statement is when we will hear about the plans for further cost of living payments. I think they are going to be needed. My honourable friend on the front bench from Wirral South was absolutely right to make the point that in many respects the security has been removed from social security. That is a very lamentable feature of the last few years. The level of benefits is much too low. It's not been properly uprated. I do want to renew the appeal I made that we should have we did have a proper uprating this year, thankfully. We do need that again next year. We're talking about a historically low level of benefits. That's the major reason why food bank demand is still rising. And if we don't get a full uprating next year, it will rise further again. I'm glad the Minister has confirmed that the Department is reviewing arrangements around transparency. I'm grateful to him for that and the confirmation he's given of the direction of travel and the work in progress. I'm also interested to hear about the staff being recruited to tackle fraud and error, and that's something that the committee would be very interested to follow progress with and perhaps table some questions about how many there are. But I am very grateful for the fact we've had this opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to everyone who's contributed to our debate.
Thank you. Order. Order. The question necessary to dispose of proceedings on the motion stands over until 7 p.m. tomorrow under Standing Order 54. That means we don't have the vote now. We have the vote tomorrow. So, we will now proceed to the next item on the estimates. I will pause very briefly to allow a changeover of dramatis personae. We come to the motion on the estimate for the Ministry of Justice insofar as it relates to His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. I call the Minister to move the motion formally.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper, and the debate will be opened by the Chair of the Justice Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to open this important debate, and I'm grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for giving us the opportunity to debate this particular part of the Ministry of Justice estimates. I'm glad to see the Minister and Shadow Minister in their places, and I want to raise, as succinctly but with some detail as I can, a number of pressing areas that the Select Committee has which trouble us about the situation in relation to our prisons and probation service, despite the increases in funding that have recently been achieved, because there is a background which causes, I think, real difficulties in both our prison and probation service. I want to highlight, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, 4 areas in particular where I'd argue that the Minister ought to go back to his colleagues and seek to persuade the Government to prioritise and increase their efforts for the sake of both those who work in Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service and the offenders it is meant to manage and also hold safely but humanely, and with a view to reform wherever possible. And the issues I wanted to flag up are prison capacity and the projected prison population, overcrowding, the quality of the prison estate, prison and probation workforce shortages, and the youth custody estate. And this is a matter which the Select Committee has looked at on a number of occasions. We're currently in the course of carrying out an inquiry into the prison workforce. I'm very grateful to all those who have given evidence so far, and I also appreciate the engagement we've had with ministers in this regard. But let me start then with what I think is one of the most pressing issues facing the prison service today. We've got now the latest prison population projections and the reasons for the increase. The reality is simply this: the prison population has grown substantially over the last 30 years, and as of last Friday, there are some 85,851 people in prison. Imagine that's changed a bit since even then. Despite the Government's efforts to manage the population, England and Wales has the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe, and of course it is projected to grow further. We see no sign so far of that rate of imprisonment falling. Ironically, whilst at the same time we have one of the highest rates of imprisonment in Western Europe, we also have one of the worst rates of reoffending. And that, I think, that ironic dichotomy is something that we have failed, successive governments have failed to address. Of course I will.
To the honourable gentleman for giving way. I think he knows my bona fides on matters of law and order, as indeed the Minister does, and my right honourable friend, or my honourable friend on the opposition front bench does. If you're bad and you're dangerous, you should be in prison and the public should have protection from you. But we don't talk often enough about prevention or rehabilitation, because it would cost far less to keep people out of prison and to stop them going back into prison than it is to keep them in prison.
I couldn't agree with the honourable gentleman more. I think the current Lord Chancellor on the previous occasion has used the phrase, prison is there for the people who we are entitled to be afraid of, not for the people that we're annoyed with or angry with. And the distinction is an important one. It's there to deal with those who are a danger to society or have significantly harmed society. It's not there, in the ideal world, to deal with those who have got their lives into a mess for any number of reasons and can be a nuisance to society, but are surely better handled than incarceration at the rate of some £40,000 a year to keep them in a closed estate. Perhaps I can make a little bit of progress and return to that theme. Now, back in 2017, the Justice Committee held an inquiry into the prison population. There had been a reduction of about 15% in the budget between 2015 and 2020. That had impacted, it was found there, the safety and decency of the estate, as well as a reduction in the number of prison officers between 2010 and 2015. In truth, there has been underinvestment in prisons, and I would argue underinvestment in the whole of the justice system for decades, under governments of all complexions. But because the Ministry of Justice is both an unprotected department in budgetary terms and also a downstream department, it picks up very often the consequences of things that have gone wrong elsewhere in society and elsewhere in the governance system. It's particularly vulnerable. When we looked at the position then in 2017, you've seen a 20% increase in those 15 years. Future projections then were indicating growth to 2022. There was, at that time, a prison estates transformation programme that was committed to expanding the prison estate by 10,000 places and to close outdated prisons. Truth is, sadly, that was not fully delivered on. The Public Accounts Committee reported that just 206 places were delivered out of that programme. 2018, the Department, Ministry of Justice, decided not to deliver the prison estates transformation in full because of budgetary pressures. That removed around 6,500 places from the programme. But nothing has been done to reduce the demand. Indeed, a number of changes to sentencing policy have in fact increased the demand in a number of areas. That inquiry in 2017 found clear evidence that the reduction of spending in prisons had had a major destabilising effect, reducing staff, put more pressure on those still there, and the way outsourcing facilities management services was done, block contracts, meant that the operation was very remote, very unresponsive to day-to-day needs in the prisons. Very frustrating for governors who were finding frequently it took months to get basic repairs done. The nature of the contract what was seriously at fault. I don't have a problem with contracting out in the right circumstances, but the way it was done was extremely inefficient. We then got to a stage where 6 years on, the prison service largely faces the same issues. The population is continuing to increase. There's still an issue with recruitment and retention of staff, and the estate still has capacity pressures. In 2019, there was another prison expansion programme. The Prison Strategy White Paper said the provision of prison places would make a more modern and secure estate. Well, as part of that programme, there was an ambitious target of 20,000 additional prison places. However, what we now know is that planning permission for 3 of those prisons has not been granted. I think it's actually been either refused or no decision has been made, and the Ministry is having to appeal those planning decisions. That's hardly joined-up government. Surely the risk of delays in planning should have been foreseen at the very outset. I wrote on behalf of the committee to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice following the publication of its main estimates, and I'm grateful to the Permanent Secretary for responding yesterday to me. It's disappointing, though, to see that only 8,200 new prison places will have been created and be made operational by May 2025. So we're about 11,800 short of the government's target of 20,000 by the mid-20s. Now, I'd ask the Minister, when he responds, to confirm, is he really convinced, against that background, that the current prison expansion programme is genuinely deliverable? When are we going to get to the 20,000? What are the steps that are being taken to speed up a rate of delivery that so far will not get us there? The reality is prisons in England and Wales are reaching breaking point. We've got to a situation now, the growth in the adult male population has forced the government to use police cells to accommodate prisoners through Operation Safeguard. The government said that that would be in place for no longer than necessary. But again, how much longer does the Minister anticipate that will be the case? How frequently is Operation Safeguard being used at the moment? I mentioned the changes to sentencing policy, which has actually put more pressure on prisons. For example, you've got the position of changes to magistrate sentencing powers. They were increased to 2 years, then suddenly they were temporarily reduced back down to 1 year. I don't think that's good lawmaking. I don't think it's fair or just, frankly, in terms of sentencing policy, that it's a lottery as to when a defendant appears before the court, as to whether he's dealt with by the magistrates or committed to the Crown Court. The reality, we all know, is that was done not because magistrates are sentenced more heavily. There's no evidence to suggest that. But it was done, of course, because if people are sent to the Crown Court for sentence, because the magistrates deem their powers insufficient, it will take longer before they end up in prison. So there's a bit of sleight of hand in this, in truth, that it's done to ease out the demand in the prison in the prison system. It pushes their arrival in prison back down the road a bit, in the hope that somebody else will have left by then, so there's a bit more space. That's not, I think, the right approach as far as that's concerned. And of course, what it does then do, it puts more pressure on another part of the Ministry of Justice's responsibility, more pressure on the Crown Courts, because more cases are being then sent to the Crown Court that could have been dealt with more quickly by the magistrates. That's a situation I think the government needs to address. What's going to be done to deal with that? How long does the Ministry envisage this reduction in sentencing powers lasting? And what's being done to consult with the judiciary about whether this is a proper approach to the use of judicial resources and sentencing policy? We've used, I know, there's been a temporary response for rapid deployment cells, and that may offer some support, that may be of some assistance. But what's the long-term plan? How long do we envisage the rapid deployment cells will be in use? What's the plan eventually to integrate those with the rest of the estate? We've got the plans for the 20,000 prisons, but I say the delay is very significant. That means that there's significant overcrowding in the estate, and that's the second point that I wanted to come on to. And the overcrowding is such that, of course, it's very difficult for the prison staff to carry out the rehabilitative work, which is one of the objectives of prison. That feeds in to that very high rate of recidivism, reoffending, that I've already referred to. It also, I think, creates real challenges for our basic duties of care towards both prisoners and prison officers as well. When the state removes someone's liberty for the broader public good, they have a duty to commit to keep them safe and in decent conditions. They equally have a duty to those who work on behalf of the state in supervising those people and running those prisons to give them decent, safe and reasonable working environments. And I fear at the moment, in a number of our prisons, we are simply not getting there. We're simply failing in that, and repeated reports from Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons flag that up. The growth in the numbers of urgent notifications that have been issued by the Inspector to the Ministry is also evidence of that. And I appreciate the Minister's always responded promptly to those urgent notification procedures, and I'm grateful to him for that. But it speaks to an underlying problem that needs to be resolved, and I suspect that can only be done by sustained investment. And perhaps also thinking about, are we really using the alternatives to prison effectively to make sure, going back to the point that was made earlier by the Honourable Member opposite, that we use it for those who are dangerous and where there's no other safe means of dealing with them, as opposed to cheaper and also very often more effective in terms of rehabilitative alternatives. So we're at this situation where you've got many Victorian prisons, the local prisons as they're often called. Some of those are in a very poor state. They've been described as not fit for purpose, dilapidated, historical underinvestment in maintenance. There's a backlog of maintenance work in the prisons in March 2021, estimated to be about £1 billion. HMPPS is regularly taking prison cells out of use because of the state of disrepair. So between 2009-10 and 1920, over that decade, 1,730 prison cells were permanently out of use for failing to meet the required standards. The lack of money going into basic maintenance adds, therefore, to that capacity crisis. Of course I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Chair Selectman, he's making an excellent critique of the system. There's something ironic, isn't there, about prisons being so under-maintained and needing £1 billion spent on them, such that their accommodation isn't available, when some £4 billion is being spent on new prisons at the same time, and it looks like we're just forgetting the ones that we have, particularly the remand and the local prisons.
I've got a sympathy with that point. And of course the irony is, not only are some of those old prisons being described by the Chief Inspector of Prisons in his 2021 annual report as being cold, dark and shabby cells, often plagued by damp and cockroaches, leaking pipes and toilets, broken and missing furniture or windows. That's the position that the Chief Inspector has found, and at the same time, as we've already observed, the new prison building schedule is way behind, and because of the planning situation, so far we've got no assurance as to when those places will be delivered, and in any event, will they be eaten up, not to replace the dilapidated prisons, as was originally the hope, but in fact simply to increase capacity because we've got a tap that nobody seems able to find a means of properly turning off in terms of those coming in to the system. The original plan, of course, was to close old prisons as part of the Prisons Estate Transformation Programme, but frankly, that hasn't happened. In 2019, the Minister's predecessor said that we need to be kept open. Well, how long do we expect to keep these prisons open? What is the long-term plan for those prisons? And what is the plan to make sure that the risks in relation to planning permissions and restrictive covenants, which plague the potential redevelopment of Holloway, for example, are not recognised and sorted out well in advance of commitment of the capital? Second issue I've got, it's worth just observing too very quickly that we've had an increase in the capital DEL, as it's called, a departmental expenditure limit for prisons. That's welcome. But if we're only so far spending a fraction of it, about 4 million as I recall it, we spent about 1.6 billion so far. Clearly, we've got resource being allocated by the Treasury, which so far we can't have confidence that the Ministry is able actually to spend and deliver in a timely fashion. What are the steps that the Ministry is taking to deal with that? What reassurance can you give us? What plan is there to speed up that programme and actually get the resource spent where it's needed? The operational workforce is the other issue I wanted to deal with. As I say, we have a current inquiry on this. I just want to pay tribute to the people, men and women who work in our prisons. They do a very tough job, and one that probably no one in this House would want to have to do, but they do it on behalf of society. They do it frequently in difficult, as I've said, unpleasant, sometimes unacceptable conditions, and at some risk sometimes to themselves. They deserve to have the recognition that I don't think they always get, and I certainly on behalf of the Select Committee want to recognise and salute them for what they do. But we need more than just recognition and warm words. We do need some real support for them. The Justice Committee did a survey as part of our inquiry, Mr Deputy Speaker, and of serving prison officers. Some 6,582 staff responded to us. That's a decent number in terms of a survey. The responses, the results are pretty striking. We found that half of Band 3 to 5 staff don't feel safe at the prison they work in. That surely is a basic right anyone has, to feel safe at work. Half is a frightening statistic. We know too that reports both from the Inspector and the Independent Monitoring Boards have highlighted the growing number of assaults, both on staff, by prisoners and between prisoners as well. That's a result of the cramped and overcrowded and stressful conditions in which many are held. So no surprise, perhaps, that the prison officers feel so concerned at that. Band 3 to 5 and Band 2 are the key operational grades. They're the frontline people who do the jobs on the wings. And only 15% of Band 2 operative staff felt they had proper training, regular training. 25% of Band 3 to 5 said that they had regular training. The majority don't. And surely training people is a basic part of making sure that we professionalise and keep the workforce up to scratch. We're bringing in various protective equipment for them. They need to be trained to use it. Morale, therefore, is low. It's no surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over 70% of staff in Band 2, 80% of staff in Bands 3 to 5 said that staff morale was not good at the prison they worked in. If that's the position with the frontline staff, is it any wonder that we have a problem not just with the recruitment, but also with retention? Because it's quite clear that there's a real issue with experienced officers leaving the service. And of course, when things get difficult in prison, when those tensions threaten to boil over, when there is potential dispute, potential violence on the wings, it's exactly those experienced officers, the old hands, those men and women who've been around the system, know how to deal with sometimes quite damaged and quite challenging individuals. Their experience is more necessary than anyone's to calm things down and prevent things escalating. So unless we have a proper strategy for retention, I think we're creating a potential powder keg for the future. Ultimately, you've got to both retain and increase the number of staffing. Unless you do that, you will not get the purposeful activity that's necessary to make prisons beneficial. Otherwise, we end up just warehousing individuals with no benefit at the end of it. And that pressure on staffing and overcrowding in the prisons is reflected by the concern of the President of the Prison Governors Association, Andrew Albert, who said that The prison system faces an immediate crisis and could run out of prison places as early as mid-July. What's the Minister's assessment of that? Does he agree with the President of the Prison Governors Association that by a few weeks' time, a few days' time, we are potentially running out of space? If so, that we're in a very grave situation indeed. What too about the observations of the Shannon Trust, which I'm very grateful for their information, pointing out that the statistics from the Office of National Statistics, HMPPS and the voluntary sector suggest that some 62% of all those incarcerated have a literacy level lower than an average 11-year-old. Now, given that we've got some 85,000 people in prison, that potentially equates to about 53,000 people who have real literacy deficits. And without those being put right, what is their hope of getting a job upon release? How do we then get them out of that cycle of reoffending? But the problem is, because it's so difficult to carry out education activities in those cramped and inadequate facilities, because again it is difficult, frankly, to attract staff to do the tough job of education work in prisons, all too frequently the level of courses is not being delivered in the way that was intended. So that's another challenge there. What is the Minister going to do to be increasing the amount of education, the amount of purposeful activity that we see in our prisons? We all say it's the objective, but so far we're not delivering on it in any consistent manner. Let me then just look beyond prison to probation, because probation is critical and sometimes, I fear, regarded as slightly the poor relation of the two. It's inevitable, perhaps, that the bulk of the budget, of course, goes on prisons because of the very high fixed costs, but probation is absolutely essential, and we ought to pay tribute to the probation officers that work very hard. It's essential, first of all, to give alternatives to prison in the first place, and secondly, to have a proper means of transitioning prisoners back into society when they are released without the risk of reoffending. What we've found when we've carried out our inquiries are high staff vacancies, overloaded probation practitioners working over capacity, poor staff retention, inaccurate risk assessments being completed, and all those flagged up by the Chief Inspector of Probation said that many services are experiencing exceptional staff shortages and with a half of positions of key grades in some areas being unfilled. No wonder, therefore, that things are getting missed. And that's not only a risk to prisoners, that potentially sometimes in the worst case can lead to a risk to the public as well. What is being done to deal with the staff pressures in the probation service? Now, we've met many probation officers. They want to improve their service, but they need some decent and sustained funding to do it. You can't have it just being switched on and off, rather like a light switch in that regard. What we do know is that 3/5 of the HMPPS's expenditure is on prisons. We need to concentrate as well, not forget about the other 2/5, which is absolutely critical as well. I will one more time, then I'll move on.
Trade on him again. He's making an excellent speech, and I think he'll agree that the privatisation of the probation service was a disaster, and it's right that that has been reversed. But that doesn't mean that probation can't work with the private and the voluntary sector, particularly around employment, and there are some great examples of that, firms like Timpson's, the voluntary sector, organisations like PACT. It's really important that they work collectively with all of these groups to ensure that we stop people from reoffending, and not only that we do that, but we help them rebuild, get on and be successful in their lives.
He's spot on, and I join him in paying tribute to Timpson's, for example. The work of the Timpson family and their firm has been quite exceptional, consistently over a long period of time. I've got constituents of mine who have benefited through their endeavours, and I think many others in this House have as well. But the point is an important one. The Justice Committee was very critical of the way the probation service was privatised. As he knows, I don't myself have an ideological objection to privatising services in the right circumstances and in the right way. But the simple truth is the way it was done in probation was absolutely the wrong way to do it if you were going to do it. Because it split the service up, it dislocated it, this mixture of that which was retained nationally and that which was with the various outsourced companies was wholly unsatisfactory, and it created some dire results and I pay tribute actually to my right honourable learned friend, the member for South Swindon, when he was Justice Secretary, for having taken the tough but absolutely right decision to reverse that process and unify the service once more. That was very welcome, but nonetheless that has still affected morale, it has affected retention, and has created considerable dislocation in data sharing, for example, between various services, and it broke a number of the local ties that had been developed between the probation service and, let's say, local authorities, other providers in their area. And ironically, as the Honourable Gentleman says, there is a role for the private sector. The privatisation of probation was intended to have much more private sectors coming into the provision probation work, and much more smaller scale charities. Actually, what happened was it went on bulk contracts to some of the usual big outsourcers, so it defeated its own object. What we do need to do now is to work hard to make sure that we do give the charities, the not-for-profits, the small-scale organisations real access to provide services where they can bring a unique perspective. So again, I'd be grateful for the Minister's observations on what the government is going to do to encourage those providers into the sector where they can work collaboratively with the new unified service. We've got a situation now, we've got 220,000 people on probation, 16,000 staff in probation. It's been through any amount of upheaval. What it needs now is both stability and then support in practical financial terms, as well as recognition for the work that it does. Can I then turn very briefly, I have only a couple of more points to make, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the youth custody estate. Now, the youth custody has been a real success, it should be said, because we imprison far, far fewer people now than we used to. That's been a real win that all sides involved in can take credit on. It doesn't have the same pressures in terms of numbers. We've seen a steady decline in the number of children in custody. One's tempted to say, why, if we can do that in relation to children, largely because of a much more holistic approach and far more early interventions, can we not apply the same philosophy to the adult estate as well? The principle isn't different. It's getting in early when you see the first signs of the problem in people's lives that is likely to make them more vulnerable to falling into offending. We can do it for youngsters successfully. Why shan't we at least do much more of it in the adult estate too? But the situation is, although the numbers are not an issue, safety is a real concern in the youth estate. It's concerning that the issue of staff retention is a problem in the youth estate too. That impacts safety. Lack of staff and training is a matter of concern. Recent inspection reports from the Chief Inspector of Prisons have raised concern about education in the YOIs. Safety concerns extend beyond physical harm. If the institutions fail to provide adequate educational programmes, vocational training and rehabilitative regimes, young offenders won't receive the tools they need to reintegrate back into society, and they will be all the more vulnerable to being sucked back in to the leadership model of their criminal friends on the outside, many of whom they joined up in because of many gaps in their life elsewhere. I wrote to the Ministry in May about the woeful findings in relation to Her Majesty's Prison Cookham Wood in the urgent notification procedure there. And I'm grateful to the Minister for his response, but we're pretty disappointed to see yet another urgent notification being issued in relation to a failing prison, particularly one when you've got children concerned. And so I just want to express my concerns that we must see improvements for those children. They're entrusted to the state's care, and we have a duty to them to make sure that they are safe and actually leave those institutions in a better place than they came in. The government has attempted, I recognise the attempts that the government has made to try and stabilise prisons and probation by injecting funding, but it's actually making up, or trying to make up, for a great deal that's been taken out earlier on. I recognise the commitment of the Minister, and I appreciate his personal courtesy and determination in these works. I particularly recognise the commitment of the new Secretary of State, who understands these issues very well from his own professional background. But they will both know we've got a lot of ground to make up to get prisons and probation back to where they should be. The fact that there is some increase in the estimates is good news, as I've demonstrated, I fear, A, it may not be enough, B, we need to have an assurance that funding will be sustained over a period of time, period of years, and also that it can actually, the Ministry has the capacity to spend the money wisely and successfully and deliver on all of that. So I hope that the Minister will be able to respond to those matters with his usual care and courtesy, but we do need not just the words, we need a clear programme of action, and we frankly, if I may say, need to increase and raise the extent and awareness of public debate about the prisons and probation service, as we need to with the whole of the criminal justice system, because it ought to be a decent prison system, a decent probation system, a means of protecting the public but also rehabilitating those offenders who can be, ought to be a central mission to any government as a decent education system, a decent health system or a decent social care system. It doesn't get the same level of attention, and perhaps at least in a small way this debate helps to flag up some of those issues, but we all have a duty, I think, to talk about those issues to our constituents in a measured and calm way, more than perhaps we currently do. But I'm very grateful, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a real pleasure to follow that really forensic speech by the Chair of the Select Committee that took us through many of the problems, particularly in the prison service. I'm going to be rather more selective about the issues, but I will concentrate again particularly on prison conditions. 3 weeks ago I visited Wortham Scrubs prison in my constituency. It's a prison that I've visited on and off for the last 30 years as an MP, as a councillor and indeed as a criminal barrister. And despite meeting many dedicated officers and many determined governors, I've never changed my mind that it's an unsuitable institution in the 21st century, particularly for the rehabilitation or indeed the punishment of offenders. On my most recent visit, many of the men were sharing one-person cells with unshielded toilets, making their living conditions cramped and unpleasant with no privacy. Added to this, the Scrubs, like many prisons, is still operating a 23-hour lockup regime where some prisoners are only getting 1 hour a day outside their cells. Is it any wonder, given that self-harm and poor mental health are at a high across the prison estate? I recently asked a series of written questions to the Minister's Department, mainly on this topic of time out of cell. The MOJ responded that they do not hold these statistics centrally and it was not practical for them to record the data. How does the MOJ hope to have an overview of the well-being of the prison population in its care if they don't know what each prison's time out of cell regime is? I followed up to inquire why the MOJ doesn't collect this data centrally, and I was provided with a response yesterday that said the MOJ would need to record data for each prisoner individually based on his or her movements each day to understand time out of cell for each prison. And if I may say so, I think that's a ridiculous response, and the Prisons Minister has misunderstood the question, I hope not intentionally. To get an understanding of each prison's time out of cell regime, they need only to ask each prison to report this data to the MOJ. And because the data is about the time out of cell rather than the individual prisoner's schedules, it will be much simpler to collect than they pretend. The Minister's jumping from a sedentary position. I'm sure he will, when he responds, deal with this point in more detail. I also asked about the overcrowding conditions in prisons at Justice Questions a couple of weeks ago. The data for this is held and published by the government, but I don't think it's an accurate representation of what is and isn't an overcrowded prison. For example, when visiting Wortham Scrubs, the governor told me she'd just been asked by the MOJ to increase operational capacity. How will we ever know if a prison is overcrowded if the MOJ just keeps moving the goalposts of operational capacity? And if the MOJ keeps asking prisons to increase operational capacity, then it will become an even bigger problem of overcrowding and something of a hidden one as well. So prisons are overcrowded, single cells are being used to house 2 people, most time out of cell regimes are oppressively restrictive, And what necessitates much of this is the fact there's an insufficient number of staff on the wings. Prisons need more staff, and prisons can't hire more staff if their budget doesn't allow it. Prison officers are leaving the profession in their droves, and it isn't hard to see why. It's a very dangerous job where you're at very real risk of physical injury. It's also emotionally taxing, seeing prisoners, some at the lowest points in their lives, and getting very little assistance by way of productive work, education, and other support. The pay does not do the job justice, and is proof that the MOJ has insufficient regard for the profession. It wastes thousands of pounds training new prison officers who then leave within the first 2 years due to the conditions. It's clear something is going very wrong here, and the government need to fix the problem. Yes, of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, as well as prison officers. Would he join me in paying tribute to prison chaplains, and particularly his own local prison in Wormwood Scrubs, where Father Jerry McFlynn was the chaplain for a long time. He's now the director of the Irish Crescent for prisoners overseas. I know my honourable friend, right honourable friend from Hayes and Harlington will know him. Father Jerry celebrated his Golden Jubilee just last week. He's 50 years an ordained priest, and he's dedicated his whole life to prisons and prison chaplaincy, and I'm sure he'll join me in sending his regards, as indeed will all members.
I'm very glad to take that intervention, because prison chaplains, prison priests, prison vicars, and prison imams, which we have an excellent one at the Scrubs, are the unsung heroes in many ways, and do a fantastic job alongside, as he says, the other staff. The problem is, I'm afraid, often, however, the MOJ itself, seemingly always one of the first government departments to offer itself up as soon as the Chancellor of the Day mentions cuts. Their budget is, I think, now 12% lower than it was in 2010. If prisons don't have the staff to safely unlock the prison for a reasonable period of time, if prisons don't have the money to provide meaningful activities, and if they aren't the resources to provide good quality education, mental health declines. This can have a tragic consequence for prisoners and staff. I want to come back in a moment to the issue of education, but I'll briefly mention mental well-being in prison. I recently met a lawyer who's been representing 4 bereaved families of prisoners from Wormwood Scrubs who took their own lives between April 2020